Okay, good morning, everybody. It's just after 9 now, and I'm sure people will still arrive as we're going along. I'm Peter Rule, if I haven't met you. I think I've met most of you or all of you. So I just want to talk about the program, and you'll see that our focus today is on approaches to research. And we've got a lot of different approaches that we want to look at. We can't go into any of them in a lot of detail, but we hope that we can introduce you to the different approaches, and that by the end of the session, you'll have a good idea of your own approach if you're starting out in your first year. And if you're busy in your second or third or fourth years, it'll just give you some additional information about research approaches so that you can consolidate your understanding of the approach that you're using. Okay, so that's what we want to try to achieve today. You'll see that we have got a parallel session, so we'll start off together looking at how do you choose your research approach. And then we'll have a couple of parallel sessions where Professor Le Grange will run one stream and I'll run the other one. And one of the one stream will be case study and narrative research. So that stream will stay in this room. And then survey and experimental design will move to 3008. Okay. So we've got that room booked as well. And then we'll have tea and come back together, and we'll have a session on mixed methods research, which I'll do with Professor Le Grange, and then we'll have a session on policy and conceptual studies, where Professor N Davids will lead us in that one. Okay. Right now, I think you've probably got an idea of the approach that you're using in your research, but it's a really good idea to expose yourself to a range of approaches. Okay. Because as masters and PhD students, you're interacting with research from a variety of sources and using a variety of approaches. So it's a good idea to be educated about different approaches. Even if you're not using a particular approach, it can be really valuable to know about it. So that's why it's good to expose yourself not only to your particular research approach, but to a range of approaches. Does that make sense? So in a way, you're educating yourself as a master reader and as a researcher about a range of approaches. And you'll find that as you continue in your research career, you tend to specialize in particular approaches, but it's very important to know about other approaches. If you tend towards the qualitative side of research, it's very important to know about the quantitative and how people do that kind of research, and vice versa, as well as what mixed methods involves, because increasingly people are using mixed methods approaches. Okay, so that's just by way of introduction. Just to, before we go further, can we just check who's here? So if you're a master's student, just put up your hand. Okay, so great. So we've got, and PhD students? Okay, so we've got a nice mixture. And then if you're a first year student, why don't you just put up your hand? Okay, great. And then second years? Third? Fourth? Okay, great. So we've fifth? Okay. So that we've got a nice mixture of years and masters and PhD as we usually have. So that's great. So some of you in your first years, you might still be thinking about your approach and working on your proposal. So this will give you a chance to consider your approach and get a bit more information about a range of approaches. And then those who've already had your proposal passed and you're busy with your research, you can test out your ideas about your approach and whether you're on the right track in using your approach and how your approach links or compares with other research approaches. Right, so I hope all of you will get something out of this session. Right. As usual, we will send you the notes, so don't feel you have to take all the notes. And also we're busy setting up a site on the faculty, the education faculty website for where we can put all these notes in the same place. And then, so we'll inform you about that as well. Okay. Right, so let's move on to talk a bit about research approaches, and just to introduce research approaches. And the question really is, how do you choose your research approach? But before we talk about that question, let's just talk about what is a research approach. And you'll know from reading the literature that in educational research, the terminology can be quite confusing because people don't always use the same terms. So research approach is sometimes called other things. So sometimes people would call it a research design. Or sometimes people call it a methodology. So when you're reading, you have to kind of ask yourself, what are they talking about? What level of description are they talking about? But a research approach is really the way you combine all the different elements of your research into one kind of box. Okay, so you could call that box a case study, or a narrative design, or a survey design, or action research. But it's the thing that links all of those elements together. Okay, does that make sense? So that's your research approach. It's not the same as a paradigm. Remember, we've talked about research paradigms. The paradigm is a much broader understanding of what is knowledge, what is reality, about values and that kind of thing. So the paradigm kind of is a bigger frame, and the research approach would fit within that bigger frame. Right? It's also not the same as a research method. Okay, so the methods are the more specific ways that you use to collect data or to analyze data. So a research approach, for example, a case study, would use a variety of methods to collect data and to analyze data. Okay. So you're getting a sense of these different levels of description. You've got a paradigm, which is the big thing, which is really about your overall assumptions regarding knowledge and reality. And then the approach is the smaller box of elements that you use in your research design. And then the methods are more specific ways of collecting and analyzing data. Okay. And all of these different things have to kind of fit together. Okay. But as we go along, if you've got questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Right. I think a very important part of a research approach is that it must be coherent. Right. So if you working in a particular paradigm, the approach needs to kind of fit in with that paradigm, and the methods need to fit in with the approach. So there should be a coherence that runs through your research design. Okay. Right. Now, so the question then is, how do we choose the approach? How do you choose your research approach? Because there are very many approaches. Here's just a few of them. You'll see case study and narrative, which we're going to talk about today. Action research and phenomenology. We won't have a chance to talk about them today, but those are also important approaches. Design-based research, survey and experimental design, mixed methods, conceptual analysis, policy analysis, and many others. Right. So there's a whole plethora of these approaches. And it can be quite confusing to try and work out, well, how do I choose? Okay. So what I want you to do is just to chat for a minute with your partner. How do you choose a research approach? I'll give you a couple of minutes to talk about that, then we'll talk about that together. Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop you there, and let's pool our ideas together. We are recording this session because of people who aren't able to come have requested that we record the session. So I'm going to just be repeating some of the things you say, just so that we can, record the feedback. So don't worry if it's a bit clumsy. So let's just open it up. You've got this multitude of approaches that you're confronted with. how do you choose an approach for your research study? Right, and I'll just open it up. Would anyone like to share your ideas about that? And especially those who now in your second, third, fourth years. Right, tell us your secrets. Yeah. Okay. Who'd like to start us off? Yeah. Yes.
The kind of knowledge I want to construct, it's leading me to choose the approach. I would say it's my epistemological stance.
Okay. Okay, so that's one point. It's about your stance, your epistemological stance, and related to the kind of knowledge you want to construct. Could you just elaborate and give us an example on that, please? You give us your example of your study.
Okay. For instance, if my epistemological position it's that knowledge is constructed socially.
Yes, yes.
Then the kind of knowledge that I want to construct, I would say in those approaches, I would choose the one which suits the social construction
Yes.
kind of knowledge.
Okay, right. So I think that's the point I was making earlier about coherence, that your approach needs to fit in with your paradigm in a way. So if you're working within a social constructivist paradigm, right, then your approach and your ideas about knowledge need to be consistent with that. So I think that's a valuable point. Thank you. Right, any other ideas? Yes?
I think what we said linked very much with what she's saying, and that is the fact that your question is basically to determine your whole study.
Okay.
So whatever you want to find out, where was your starting point, that will determine what approach you have to use.
Okay, good. So your research question, that will lead to your research approach. What I'd like to add to that is your research purpose. Okay. So often your research purpose will help you formulate your research question or questions, and then that will help you to choose your research approach. Right. Okay. So I think that kind of logic is very important. In fact, you should start with what are you trying to achieve in your research? Okay. And when you're thinking about a research purpose, it's important to think about it as a verb. What is it that you want to do? So you typically formulate your purpose using the word to something, like to investigate, to explore, to test, to evaluate, those kinds of action verbs, right? And then it would be, what is it that you want to do that thing to? So to test an intervention to improve grade 4 mathematics or something like that, right? So it's to the verb, then the object, okay? And if you can formulate it in that way, that will help you to work out what questions to ask, and then that'll help you to work out what approach that you'll adopt. Okay. Right. Yes?
Is it feasible to say that keeping all of that at the back of your mind, I would also have to work within the limitations that I have regarding budget and time?
Yes.
So that it fits in, that I don't spend like 5 years on a project that should have taken me 18 to 24 months.
Yes, absolutely. So things like time and budget, energy,
And other obligations, your work, your family.
Okay, I think that's very useful. Thank you for that, because you have to think about the reality of your own life and what's achievable in terms of your own life. And especially if you think about, I mean, most of you as postgrad students are working, you kind of mid-career, mid or early career, or and you've got multiple commitments, including family and work and community and so on. So in a way, you have to work out what's manageable for you as well, and what's practical for you. So I think those are very important considerations. Thank you for that. Okay. And then I think, sorry, I'm just going to add another one, which is relationships. Important to think about that as well, because you have to juggle these different imperatives in your life and make sure that you don't destroy everything. Yeah.
I'm not sure whether this will be in isolation of that or it will be together with it. The fact that it has to be something that I can manage.
Yes.
If I want to do focus group interviews, can I manage that?
Yeah.
If I want to do questionnaires, is it easy for me to handle dealing with questionnaires? So it has to be something that I can do.
Yeah. Good. Yes. So and it needs to be appropriate for the scale of your study. So say you're doing a master's, and you're not going to survey 5 universities in South Africa and interview 10 people in each university, right? So it must be an appropriate scale for your particular degree or program, okay? And that links to manageability and practicality. Okay, so those are also really important factors. Okay. Yes?
Al die etiese considerasie.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So the ethical considerations could be another important factor. So could you just explain a little bit in what way would the ethical factors?
I'm a teacher, but I'm also a researcher teacher.
Yes.
And in my case, it's easier to work with teachers than with children because
Yes.
I don't have so much
Yes, permissions. Yeah. Okay, good. So you should think about the ethical requirements as well. Could have an impact on the approach you choose. So particularly the site you choose as well as the participants. I think that even though it is more rigorous, there are more rigorous requirements to work with children, that doesn't mean you shouldn't. Okay. So it just means you need to think more about the ethics and maybe get more permissions and so on. So it is a consideration, but it shouldn't determine your research in the end. I think this can be a problem. I've worked with quite a few students who in the area of disability, and if you're doing research around disability, it's also there are a lot of ethical challenges. So you have to think through it very thoroughly, but the ethical challenges shouldn't stop the research, because otherwise it's marginalizing those people even more than they are marginalized. Okay, but thank you for the point. I think it is, you have to consider that. Especially if you, say for example, you're a principal working at a school and you want to do research in your own school, that can be problematic from a kind of ethical point of view and in terms of power dynamics, because people might simply give you the answers that they think you want. Okay, so, and the same with children and parents and so on, and your class or other classes. So thank you for that. Yes? Yes? Do you want to?
Also, another thing we talk about is, are you the teacher looking out to other teachers, or are you the researcher and teacher in your own case and other cases?
Yeah. So I'm going to use this word positionality. Right. So what I mean by positionality is the way you are positioned in relation to the research. Okay. So often we have multiple roles within research. So you might be a teacher, and then you're also researching your own class. I know some you have that challenge. Eh? So that can create a tension, because you've got a kind of vested interest in making the research work to show that your teaching is working. So you have to kind of be aware of what roles you're playing and how those roles relate to each other, and when they might be in conflict. Right. Yes, it has implications for your own bias and objectivity. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do that, but you have to be aware of it. In some cases, you might decide I can't do that because it's just too difficult. There's too much of a tension. Especially say you've got two classes and you're trying one thing with one class as a control, as control and experimental groups. Then that can create ethical problems around who's benefiting. Okay, so all of those things are things you need to consider. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a really good list of factors to consider when you're doing your research. I think the main point there is that the purpose should determine the approach. But you have to think about that in relation to all those other factors and your own context as a researcher. Okay. Right. Yes, I think that the literature would help you in deciding, in helping you to decide what approach to use, because you can look at what have other people chosen who are looking at the similar topics, right? So that's why it's good to work on the literature before you even do your proposal, because you'll get a sense of other people have used these approaches in relation to this topic. I will decide to do the same, or I'll do something different for these reasons. So you need to have a strong rationale for your research approach. Okay. Yes.
I don't know if it fits in maybe with what she said or what she said, but also your skills. So if you choose maybe a focus group interview with the ethics, when does it border on bribing? When does it border on reading questions? How do you sort of bring a group back? And
doesn't that link with the management ability? The fact that you can manage what you do.
But your inner, because sometimes you might be in a bad space emotionally, and then you in this because your time is so, and then you make a decision that might not be, I don't know, sound, academically sound.
Yeah, the context of the research.
Yes, okay. Thank you. I think that's a very important point. So your own skill set. So, say it would depend also on your prior learning and your prior expertise. So someone might have a strong statistics background, which means that they would perhaps gravitate towards a more quantitative approach and maybe do a survey or an experimental design. Other people might come from humanities background and have a strong affinity with an interpretivist type of approach where you interview people and you interpret texts. So it is good to consider your own strengths. But again, that should only be one consideration. If your own strengths don't fit the purpose, then you need to work that out. Okay. Right. So you can't say, I'm going to do a survey because I did statistics, and with no reference to the purpose or questions or whatever. Then there could be a mismatch between your purpose and your approach. Okay. Right. Okay, so now we've had a bit of a discussion about how do you choose your research approach. And what I want you to do now is I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to talk to your partner and say, this is the approach I'm thinking about, and these are my reasons. Okay. So see if you can begin to identify an approach. Some of you will already have done that, okay, because you're busy with your second or third, fourth years. If you're in the first year, just think about, this is the approach that I'm thinking of using. This is why I'm thinking about using it. And see if you can start to develop the rationale. Okay, I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Right, I'm going to stop you there. So I think now I've given you a chance to begin to formulate a rationale for your approach And I think that it's really important to be able to have a chance to develop your thinking around this, okay? Because it's not enough to say I'm using this approach. You have to have good reasons for choosing that approach. And as I said, in educational research, we've got these so many different approaches, and there's a number of different paradigms, and that makes it different to research in other areas. So, for example, in medical research, there's fewer sort of approaches, and there's a clearly dominant paradigm. So in a way, there's less choices, right? Whereas in education, you've got this wide range of choices. So in making your decisions, you do need to have very good reasons that you can defend, right? So we were having a discussion. So you can't put in your thesis, I'm choosing phenomenology because my supervisor told me to. Okay, right. So although the supervisor does play an important role in advising you, and the supervisor might have particular expertise, but still your approach needs to fit in with the purpose of your research and your questions, right? And also it needs to make sense in terms of the practical considerations and your own skill set and so on and so on. Yes?
Sorry, can I add one on that
Yes.
board? Prior knowledge is also
Yeah.
really important.
Good. I think that it links to this one of your own skill set. So let me just add it in there. So prior knowledge.
For example, I first determined my method because I'm working with a computer-based program, and that indicated which approach I'm going to use.
Okay.
And based on prior knowledge, I realized that a case study is not enough. I need to have a survey or a focus group as well.
Yes.
Focus group is going to be more time-consuming, so that's why I'm using a survey, and at the end, that's a mixed method. So
Okay, right. Yeah. So I think that, again, you just need to be careful about not confusing these different levels of description. Okay. And so just to conclude this session, I just want to give you a couple of examples of, a paradigm, an approach, and methods, and how those things fit together. Because it's easy to slip between them, and then it can be quite confusing. Okay. Let me just make that a bit bigger. Can you read that okay? Yeah. Oh, okay. Right. So say, for example, you're working within an interpretivist paradigm. Right. So does that make sense to you when I say that? Does it ring any bells? Right. So interpretivism would be a way of understanding knowledge and reality. Right. So interpretivism would say knowledge is socially constructed, and that the subject is a key. That there are many realities. Each subject has their own reality, right? So say you're working within that paradigm, right? Then certain approaches kind of fit in better with that paradigm than other approaches. Right. So what kind of approach do you think might fit in better with interpretivism? Narrative. Who said that? Yes. Sorry, I don't mean to. Could you just explain why do you think narrative fits in well with interpretivism?
It's because social construct and people are sharing particularly their own stories, or you're interviewing people.
Okay, right.
Interviewing people or groups means they're telling their stories of their lives, and it's basically
Good. Okay.
doesn't matter.
Right. Okay, so do you see, a narrative would give you insight into the way that the subject constructs his or her own reality, right? Because they're telling you their story. So it's about the subject and the way they understand the world. So that fits in well with an interpretivist paradigm, because interpretivists would focus on how people make meaning of their own realities, right? So in order to make meaning of your own realities, you'd use a narrative approach to investigate people's stories, and then the method, the typical method that's used, and we'll talk about this more, is an open-ended interview. Right? It could be semi-structured or with minimal structure to get someone to tell the story of their life. Right. So do you see how the paradigm and the approach and the methods kind of fit together? Right. So now it wouldn't work so well if you had a survey as your method there, because the survey is better for a broad perspective on what a big sample of people think. Right. It's not going to give you the deep insight into how a person constructs their own story. Right. Yes, sir?
But then can you have a survey as a
Yes.
start?
Yes.
And then from there then choose.
Yes.
In terms of like just few people to interview to actually enhance that narrative approach.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. So let me just give you another example. Right. So say you're using let's call it a mixed methods approach. Typically, mixed methods fits in with it can fit in with a range of paradigms. Okay, but some people associated with what is called pragmatism. Okay, so a pragmatist paradigm would say, we use what's useful, what makes sense, right? So we're not worried about the subject and the object and whether the world exists or not. We're just going to use what makes sense. Okay, that's a pragmatic type of paradigm. So pragmatism is often linked with mixed methods, and then mixed methods might use methods that generate both quantitative and qualitative data. Okay, so for example, you might do a survey and generate some quantitative data from a big sample, and then from that sample, you might then choose a smaller sample of people to interview, and then that would be more the qualitative side of your study. Okay. It can fit in with a variety of paradigms, for example, critical theory or even interpretivism. Okay. Yeah. Now I'll give you one more example. Right. So say you are you're more interested in quantitative data, and you want to test a particular approach. Then typically that would fit in with something like a post-positivist or positivist paradigm. So there your approach would be experimental design. And then your methods, you'd use something like pre-test and post-test. Right. So say you want to see whether a particular approach works in your grade 4 maths classroom. Then you test the children before you do it, and then you see how they do. Then you implement the method, and then you test them afterwards to see what the result was of using that particular method. So that would be we call that pre-test, post-test design. Right. So do you see that fits in more with a positivist thing with conducting an experiment and getting quantitative data, which you can then make some kind of conclusion about, does that work or not in improving their ability to do X or Y. Okay. Right. Okay, good question. Yeah. So we'll have to give one more example just to illustrate. Action research is often associated with critical theory, okay? Because critical theory has an emphasis on changing the world, okay? Right, so critical theorists would be interested in the underlying mechanisms of power and oppression that shape reality. And they also been interested in how do you transform those relations of oppression. Right. So action research has an emphasis on identifying a problem and then working out a solution to that problem, implementing the solution, and then evaluating the solution. And you go through those steps in what's called an action research cycle. Right. So action research would fit in well with that broader paradigm of critical theory, because action research is about trying to improve a situation or change a situation. Right. And action research works within these cycles of action and reflection. So you can use multiple methods there. So it would include things like, for example, interviews. It could observations. Often participatory methods are used in action research. Okay. Does that make sense? Right. So I'm just giving you a few examples to show that when you're developing your research design, there has to be coherence between the paradigm and the approach and the methods. Okay. That doesn't mean that it's completely rigid, but you need to have good reasons to justify your choices around approach and methods. Okay. Is everyone following okay so far? And if you think about your own study, does it make sense? Especially those students who are in your second or third or fourth year, if you reflect now on the relation between your paradigm and your approach and your methods, can you see the question of coherence and how important that is? Okay. Okay. I think we'll stop there because we're just going a little bit over time now. Case study research, and so we've got about 45 minutes for each of these. So 9:45. How are we doing for time? No, 10. Okay, so we'll spend about 40 minutes on each of the approaches, and we'll start with case study, and then we'll move on to narrative. So who of you is using case study in your research? Just put up your hand if you. Okay, so quite a few of you using case study. It's quite interesting that in South African educational research, case study is a very popular approach. A few years ago, we did a survey of educational research looking at PhD and master's studies, and case study was the dominant approach. So it is a very well-established research approach in education. Unfortunately, it's not always very well used. Okay, people just tend to call anything a case study and then off they go. But it's an approach that requires a lot of rigor and careful planning and construction to make it work well. Okay, so I'm going to try and set out some of the aspects of case study, and I hope that will help you to tighten your case study approach, or give you some ideas about why or why not to choose a case study approach. Okay, so case study is used really widely in a range of disciplines. So we talk about cases in medicine, for example. You talk about a case of malaria or something like that. But we also use it in law. So you talk about the murder case or the fraud case. And then we also talk about it in social work, and now we talk about it in education. So it's quite a widely used idea, but it means different things in different contexts. So let's talk a little bit more about what do we mean by case study. So I've got a few definitions here. Let's just go through them. And I will send this stuff out so you'll have this. And these definitions highlight some of the key aspects of case study. So the first one, case study is a study of the singular, the particular, or the unique. So there is a focus on the one. You focus on one thing, right? And that one thing is a case of other similar things. Okay. So a case is always a case of something. So say, for example, you are doing a case study of a boys' primary school. That means that there are other boys' primary schools, and this is one of those cases. Right. So that's what we mean by case, is it's a case of something. Right. So if you're looking at something where there's no other cases of it, then you shouldn't do a case study. Does that make sense? Because you're looking at that case in order to understand something about the nature of those the bigger set of cases. Okay. Right. So that's an important aspect. An empirical inquiry that investigates a contemporary phenomenon in depth and within its real life context, especially when the boundaries between the phenomenon and context are not clearly evident. Okay, so this is Yin's definition. Yin is one of the key writers about case study, and he's written several books on case study, which if you're doing case study, it's important to have a look at his stuff. And this is a very famous, probably the most famous definition of case study. Some of you probably encountered it. So if we unpack it a little bit, you'll see there some of the key words he's mentioning there. He talks about a contemporary phenomenon. Okay, so something that exists in the present. So some people might object to that and say you can also do a historical case study. Okay, but anyway, Yin feels it's a contemporary phenomenon. Okay. It investigates it. Notice how he's using that word, investigate, which is quite a broad word, a broad type of research word that would include a number of different aspects. And then the two of the key words, it investigates it in depth. That's very important. So it's not just a superficial or broad analysis, it's a deep analysis. And then in its real life context. So those are two, context is also really crucial, critically important. So when you do a case study, it's important that you think about doing the depth of the case study, right? Because you're really trying to get into, understand the complexity of the particular case. And that means a deep analysis of the case. Right. And then the other aspect of context, you need to understand the context of the case and the relation between the case and its context, because that's also a really important aspect. As Yin says, often the boundaries between the case and the context are not very clearly established or not clearly evident. Okay. So when you're thinking about case study, you should be able to ask yourself, what is my case? What is it a case of? And what is the context of the case? Right. Okay. So you might say, my case is a boys' primary school in Stellenbosch, for example. Okay. And then it's a case of boys' primary schools. So there are other boys' primary schools that are other cases, right? So it fits into that class of cases. And then the context of the case would be, it's Stellenbosch, it's the Western Cape Education Department, and so on and so on. Okay. Right, so it's important to differentiate those things. What is my case? What is it a case of? And what is the context of the case? And you should be able to highlight that in the introduction of your your thesis, or set it out in your proposal very clearly. One of the big problems is that when I look at a proposal or even a thesis, I can't see what exactly the case is. Okay, so you have to be very clear about this is what the case is. This is what it is a case of, and also what is the context, because context plays an important role in shaping the case. So you have to be able to describe the context. Right. So that's Yin's description. And then another one, a systematic and in-depth study of a particular instance in order to generate knowledge. Right. So again, sort of similar. Systematic means you go through a rigorous process of investigating that particular instance. You see, again, there's this emphasis on the particular that links with the first definition. The particular, the unique, the singular. So most definitions emphasize that aspect. You're looking at one thing. Of course, you can do a multi-case study, but then you'd be looking at more than one particular case, and we'll talk about that as we're going along. Okay. Right. So that's some stuff about the definitions. What is a case? In educational research, the case could be many different things. Right. So it could be a system, the whole system, right? Or it could be an institution, a program, a classroom, a group, or even a person. Right. So it can go from quite a big thing to a very small thing, as long as it's distinctive and you can identify it and is the case of something. So you can do a case of a grade 4 pupil. That could be the case. Or it could be a case of a grade 4 classroom, right? Or it could be a boys' primary school, that the school would be the case then. Or it could be the provincial education system. Or it could be the country. I mean, you even have country studies which treat the country as a case. So, the scale can be really vary very widely. A case can also be a particular event, right? So it doesn't have to be a person or an institution, but it can be a happening, right? So the case of, the festival, or a festival, or a concert, or whatever it is, right? So I hope you're just thinking about what is your case now if you're doing case study. Yeah? Do you have a clear idea of that? Right. Yes? Yes.
This could sound a little silly, but could you differentiate then what is the difference between a case and a sample?
A case and a sample. Okay, that's a good question. It's not a silly question at all. Okay, the sample would be who. A sample is who's giving you the information in order to investigate the case. Okay, so say for example, and the sample sometimes the sample and the case might be the same. So say for example you're doing a case study of a grade 4 pupil, then the pupil might be you might interview the pupil, and he or she would be, or he would be your sample. But the sample then would be the same as the population, because there'd only be one of them. Okay, but say you're doing a case study of an institution. Say you're doing the faculty of your education at Stellenbosch University. So that's your case is the faculty. Then you'd have to select a sample of people that you'd speak to who'd give you information about that case, because you wouldn't be able to talk to everybody in the faculty, right? So then you decide, I'm going to do, for example, purposive sampling, and I'll choose maybe 3 professors, 3 lecturers, 3 students, 3 admin staff. You see what I mean? So then that would be a kind of purposeful sample, which would somehow represent the faculty as a whole. Does that make sense? So there the faculty would be your case, but the sampling would be particular participants within that case whom you choose for particular reasons. Okay, good question. Any other questions? Yeah?
In other words, a sample is within a case.
Yeah, the sample would be typically the sample would be within a case. Yeah. Sometimes you might choose to sample people who know about the case, who are not active participants. So, for example, you might decide to talk to deans in other faculties about this faculty. So they might be internal or external, but they'd be associated with the case. Yeah. Okay. Okay, right. So that's it's always a case of something, as I said. So the purpose of a case study would be to understand the complexity of the phenomenon in its context. So that's a very broad statement of the purpose. And you'd frame the purpose according to your particular case. Right. So you'll see that there's different kinds of case studies. Some people talk about exploratory case studies, and that would be if you're looking at a phenomenon that hasn't been widely researched. Right. So, for example, maybe you'd look at the whole issue around transgender in schools. Okay, it's not a very widely researched area in South Africa yet. So you might maybe you do an exploratory case study because there hasn't been much research about that in this context. Right. So exploratory case studies are good for finding out about things that haven't been researched much. Right. So then your purpose would be to explore X in Y context. Okay. But you also might do a descriptive case study where you actually describe in a lot of detail what's going on, or an explanatory case study where you're trying to explain what's happening and why it's happening using particular theoretical frameworks. Okay. So that's this purpose is a broad formulation, and you would tweak it according to your particular case and what you want to find out from that case. Right. But you notice the focus on complexity. So typically when you're doing a case study, you're trying to understand how the different factors within that case link to each other. And that can be really complex, nuanced, and sometimes even contradictory. Okay. Yes?
Can we explore and explain at the same time?
Yes, sometimes there is an overlap between them. Typically when you're exploring, you don't necessarily have a very strong theoretical framework because you're still trying to find out what's going on there. And then the explanation would come at a sort of a subsequent stage. But often description and exploration overlap very strongly, and when you're explaining something, you have to describe it. So there is an overlap between them, and you'd work out the focus or the emphasis depending on your purpose and your research questions. Right. So research questions which say what are asking about description, and then research questions that looking at why and how, especially why, is looking at more explanation. Okay. So do you see there's that alignment between the purpose, the questions, and the approach? Okay. Right, case studies are good for gaining insight into the complexities of a particular situation. Right. Because case studies try to get beneath the surface to understand what's going on underneath. Why is that situation the way it is? How do we what are the various factors that are contributing to making it what it is? Right. So complexity is important. And it's also good for choosing a small scale and manageable project related to your own context and or interests. I think this is probably the reason why it's so popular among postgrad students, because you can choose one thing, and often you can choose something that's linked to your own practice. So students will often choose a classroom, a school, a subject, and then focus on that particular thing, and then they can manage it, and they can produce something within the time frame necessary. Okay. Yes?
In a situation whereby you choose a school or a subject,
Yes.
can you do 2 or 3 different schools?
You can. You can. Again, it would depend on your purpose, but often people would do a multi-case study with 2 or 3 different cases, and that could be schools or classrooms within different schools. And then that's useful for the purposes of comparison. So you could do something like a comparative multi-case study, right, where you say you choose 2 or 3 classrooms, and then you compare what's happening within a particular subject or grade within those classrooms. Okay. In South Africa, typically people tend to choose schools from different sort of areas, geographical areas, or from different historical systems. You know our own peculiar South African language about X Model C and X House of Delegates and whatever. Right. Just to get a sense of the diversity of cases, what's similar and different about them in the South African context. Okay. Yeah, good. Any other questions about that? Okay, good. Yeah. Just to go back to that thing about the case and the context. So say, for example, your case is a classroom, say an English second language classroom, or English, what do you call it, first additional language classroom, or a home language, okay? But you define the case, right? So you'd say exactly what it is, first additional or home language, or whatever it is. And then the context would be the school, right? So in that case, in that particular example, the case is the classroom, the context is the school and the system. But you might choose the school as the case, in which case the context is the system and the area. You see what I mean? So that's why it's so important to define clearly what the case is and what the context is, because then you won't get confused in your focus. Right. Very important. It's very important. Okay. So when the point I'm trying to make is that in some studies, the case might be the context of other studies. Right. So just to give you an example, let's say you're looking at a grade 4 learner, and that is your case. A grade 4 home English language learner. Okay. And you're interested in we've got this circumstances now when many home language English learners don't speak English at home. Okay, so that's a funny kind of situation. So you want to investigate that. So you decide your case will be the grade 4 learner. Right. Then the context of that case would be the classroom and the school. You see what I mean? So the context would be the situation in which that case is embedded. Right. But now, say you change the case, and the case is no longer the learner, the case is now the classroom, the class. Right. Then what was the context now becomes the case. You get it? So now the case is the classroom, the context is the school and the system. Okay. So the reason why I'm pointing this out is because often there's a slippage between these things. Yeah? So you must be really clear about what is my case and what is the context of that case. And what is my focus? What am I focusing on in the case? So let me give you an example. Let's say my case is the grade 4 learner in the English home language classroom. And my focus within the case is the learning of English language in relation to actual home language. Right. So that's what I'm interested in. That would be the focus. The context of the case is the particular school, a classroom, school, and education system and curriculum. That's the broader situation that surrounds that case. Okay. Yes?
Yeah, in my topic I added an ethnographic approach.
An ethnographic
now
approach.
Give me the context
yes.
of my topic.
That's nice, yeah, good. And I'm glad you raised that because I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. That there's different kinds of cases. So let's move on to that. Types of case studies. So I've talked about how you can have exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering if the context would also be temporal, like in terms of time.
Yes, absolutely. Good, thank you for that. The context could, it's often a temporal or chronological context. So if you're doing a historical case study, for example, you might say, I'm looking at a particular project between the years 1990 and 2000. Right, so that would be a chronological or temporal context. And you could also have a geographical context. And say, I'm looking at this project within this particular town in the Western Cape. So that would be the geographical context. So it's good to try and circumscribe the case and the context, so you know exactly what you're looking at.
Is it possible for the context to overlap, like have a geographical and a temporal?
Yes. Yeah, that would be, all cases should have both of those things, I'd say. Because if you're looking at a contemporary phenomenon, then the temporal context is the present, or the recent present, the recent past. And then the geographical context would depend on where it's situated. Okay. So you should be able to define your case in both, in terms of both time and place. Okay. Right. Okay, so I've talked about exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory. You could also have a single or multiple case study. We've also talked about that. It's good not to have too many cases because it becomes unmanageable. Right. Especially since case study is about getting to the complexity. So you have to give yourself enough time to really investigate that case in depth. If you have too many cases, then it becomes impossible to do that. So depth is more important than breadth. So if you're choosing, don't have more than, say, 3 case studies. Then it becomes too many. Okay. And then different types of case studies. You could have a historical case study. So in my PhD, I looked at an adult education project, in a particular period. So from about 1976 to 1990. And it was in a particular geographical context of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Okay. So I defined the temporal and spatial context as parameters of the case. Okay. So that would be a historical case study. Evaluative. So you might do an evaluative case study. Your questions would be looking at things like how effective was it, or what was the impact of that particular case. So your questions would focus on evaluating the case. Right. And then ethnographic would be another kind of case study. So an ethnographic case study is when you're trying to understand the culture in which the case is situated and how the case manifests that culture by getting an insider perspective on that particular case. So one of my colleagues did an ethnographic study of grade R children. And she went and sat in the grade R classroom, just observed what was going on there for several months. Right. So that would be ethnographic study. You're trying to get inside that situation to understand how the participants experience that situation. Right. Another of my students looked at she looked at grade R learners and how they learned to read or began to learn reading at home. So she was interested in how the home environment influenced children's reading. So she chose 4 families, went and visited them many times and observed what the family did around reading and talked to the parents, and you kind of got a sense of what was happening inside the reading culture of the family. So those would be ethnographic case studies. Okay, so that's a really nice way of doing it as well. But it's very time intensive. Eh? Yeah. Yes?
Just in terms of the ethnographic case study, I'm
Yes.
doing one myself.
Okay, great.
But I'm using my experience
Yes.
in a particular frame.
Okay.
And at times I think that your bias comes through
Yes.
because you're so closely related to the context.
Yeah.
So how do you get a balanced approach in terms of that?
Okay. I think what you're talking about is sometimes called autoethnography. Okay, is that the term you're using? Yeah. So that would be when you yourself are using an ethnographic approach to investigate your own experience. Yeah. Again, one of the key issues in ethnographic research is the issue around bias and position. So I think that, first of all, ethnography recognizes that the subject would always have an influence on the research. So it's not trying to say there's no bias involved. The most important thing is to try and acknowledge the bias and make it explicit. So you're saying, these are my assumptions. This is where my assumptions come from. So you're putting them out there so that they're visible. Right. The problem is when your biases are not visible and then they're influencing the research without you really knowing about it. So I think that's the strategy, is to make them explicit and try and critically interrogate where your biases come from, and and then how you will deal with them during the course of the research. So it's almost treating yourself as a source of information. Yeah. Okay. Then I think another important distinction. Sorry, did you want another question?
No, I wanted to add on this case of biases.
Yes.
I think biases become, if they are suppressed in the research,
Yes.
they can influence the study
Absolutely. Yeah.
in not the way that you intended.
Yeah. Absolutely.
The best thing is to be, just like Prof is saying, be explicit about your biases, so that the reader can have a clue when reading,
Yes.
that the biases, as they are explicit in the study, would have done this and this.
Yes.
And last time, Prof, you mentioned, last year,
Yes.
you mentioned what is this? I'll remember the term, but that you acknowledge your biases and you arrange yourself.
Yes.
Like, I forgot that term, but I'll come back to you. It's
Is it bracketing? Is it, because we were talking about
it's transposing.
transposing. Okay. Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Then the researcher transpose
Yes.
the prejudices or the biases that you stand in a way that I know I have these biases.
Yeah.
Yet I'm getting into this research journey.
Yes.
And this is what these are my assumptions.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Thank you. That's very useful. I think that if you are able to make your biases explicit, then you can question them. So you can say, I'm coming into this research. I have a bias that I expect this to be happening. Right. So, for example, say you're investigating school leadership, right? And you come from an experience where the principal was a tyrant. Okay. So you say, then you acknowledge that. So you say, in my experience, I've had dictatorial school principals, right? So now I'm coming in, I'm expecting a certain kind of authoritarian leadership style. So if I acknowledge the bias and question where it comes from, then I can be surprised. Then I can say, oh, I expected this, but I found this something else. I didn't just impose my expectation and see the tyrant where there was no tyrant. Okay, right. So you get the idea. I think that's a very valuable thing. It applies not only to ethnography, but in some ways to all research, that it's important to acknowledge your own position and positionality and what you're bringing into the research. What are your own prejudices and assumptions? And then that if you're aware of that, it helps you to deal with them much better. Right. I just want to make one more distinction, and that is between intrinsic and extrinsic or instrumental case studies. An intrinsic case study is a case study you choose because the case itself is interesting in its own right. Okay, so something's going on that's really interesting. Maybe it's an innovative type of project that hasn't been done before. Maybe it's a school that's achieving outstanding results, but something that's interesting for its own sake. So that you'd call that an intrinsic case study, because it's of interest in its own right or for its own sake. Instrumental case study is you choosing the case because it will show you. It will shed light on a particular situation, right? So it's not the case itself that drives your attention, but it's the issue, right? So say, for example, you're looking at this issue of say, learners who are doing English home language, but they don't speak English at home, right? You're interested in that issue, right? Then you choose some different schools because they will shed light on that issue, Right. So that would be called an instrumental case study, because you're using the case as an instrument to help you understand that particular issue. Okay. So most case studies are like that. Most case studies are instrumental. But sometimes you'll find a case study where it is a really interesting, unique type of event or a happening or institution. That would be an intrinsic case study. Okay. So are you thinking about, is yours instrumental or intrinsic? Okay. Can someone tell us in your particular case? Yeah, Lydia?
Yes, I think mine is intrinsic.
Okay, tell us why.
Because it is something that is new in Namibia.
Yeah.
Like the inclusion of the science people in higher education.
Okay.
So it's just very interesting the way that it's going, because few research has been done on it, but yet the problem is there, so it's very interesting.
Okay, right. So that could be an example of an intrinsic case study. And often, if you're looking at an intrinsic case study, it would often be an exploratory case study, because little is known about that situation. Okay. Right. Other people? Yeah.
I'm also using instrumental.
Instrumental. Okay. Tell us why.
Have I got it right? My case is technology, and my context is Afrikaans home language.
Okay.
And I'm looking in different schools, like 30 schools. And I want to see what light I'm going to get out of this study, what is going on in the Afrikaans home language class, how are they using technology, what are they doing with that, what methods.
Okay. Right. So did you say you're looking at 30 schools?
Yes.
Okay. So that sounds a lot for a case study.
I'm going to do then just a survey and then put in.
I see. Okay.
10 focus.
Okay. So in a way, it sounds possibly more like a mixed method study.
I think I'm
Okay.
tend to go there. There's
Yes.
one here today.
Okay, good. No, and I think that's, often the thing about approach is that it's not so easy to choose the approach. Often you say, I'm going to do this, then there's some questions about that. Okay, I'll do this, but there's other questions about that. So I'm really pleased that you're raising that. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's difficult because you start working and then you see what the case is and decide on case study. And promoters are difficult people sometimes.
Yes.
They say, work in that way, you work in that way, and then sometimes they say, no, go that way.
Yes.
And then you have to sort it out for yourself.
Yes, yes.
And that is why that's why I'm here today.
Yes.
And so I have to sort out
Yes. No, you're most welcome. Yeah. So I'd say that if say you have a sample, we're coming back to sample. Say you're sampling 30 schools, for example, and so you'd start with a survey then, right? So a sample is a representation of a bigger population. So there's thousands of schools. You're choosing 30 of them. And then you do a survey, and then you narrow down to a certain smaller number, and then you'd hold, say, for example, focus groups. Right. So the survey would give you quantitative data, possibly, and then the focus groups give you more qualitative data. So that sounds like an ideal mixed methods type of study. Okay, because a case study would mean you go into those particular schools and spend a time there to understand exactly what's going on, the complexity of it, which means that you couldn't do 30 or even 10. You'd have to choose maybe 2 or 3 or even 1, and then go in depth to understand what's the complexity of the issues around technology in, say, Afrikaans home language. Okay, good. Right, so I think we've just about finished case study. Typically, the methods that people use in case study are interviews, right? Open-ended interviews, observations, and document analysis. So when we did the survey on case study, you had this trinity of methods, right? Interviews, observations, document analysis. But that doesn't mean you can't use other methods. You choose methods that are appropriate and will give you data that will help you to answer your questions. That's how you choose your methods. Right. So you don't have to use these methods. You can use participatory methods. For example, you might get the children to do drawings of their classroom. You might get them to take photographs. You can do focus groups. There's all kinds of other methods that you can use, but often people use these methods. So, and then the typical methods of data analysis, thematic and content analysis are the most common methods. Again, that doesn't mean you have to use them. Often, thematic content analysis gives you a basis of analysis, but you can add additional levels of analysis. For example, discourse analysis or narrative analysis. Okay. Yeah, so there we are. That's just the final thing is key considerations. When you're doing a case study, you do need to think about bias. So what is your own position? Are you part of that case? If you're part of the case, then you have to acknowledge your multiple roles. So when I did the case study of this project in Johannesburg, I had taught at the project as an adult educator. So I had that role. Then I was a current board member of the project. And then I was also a researcher. So you see there's a complicated set of roles there. And I had to be very aware of the different roles and how they related and what the power dynamics were. Okay. So you need to acknowledge your own roles and your own bias. Generalizability, you can't generalize from one or two cases to all the others. So you can't say, because I found this in this school, it means that this is the problem everywhere. Okay, you have to be very careful about recognizing the limitations of the case study. The purpose of a case study is not to generalize. It's to understand what's going on there. If you understand that in depth, it can generate ideas which can be useful elsewhere. But it's not going to, you can't expect that this case is going to reveal the problem in all the other cases. That's a misunderstanding of case study. Okay, so it's not, the purpose is not generalizability. It's to get deep understanding and insight of that particular case. And then that can be useful for other cases, or it might not be. Right.
Does it then, Prof, give you room as a researcher to make your own analysis to reflect back to the questions that you have asked? Does it give you that room to reply?
Yes. I think your analysis will be specific to that particular case, but you might draw on theories and concepts to help you do the analysis, which have been used perhaps in similar or other kinds of cases. Okay. Right. Truth as multi-perspectival. So typically a case study, you won't just choose one source of information. You try to choose multiple sources so you can get different perspectives on the case. Right. So when you say you're looking at a class, you're not going to just talk to the teacher. Maybe you talk to the learners as well, or the principal, or the parents. So you get multiple perspectives on what's going on in that situation. And typically case study will also use multiple methods, not just interviews, but also observation, document analysis, photo voice, whatever. So that's called triangulation or crystallization, that you're getting a whole variety of perspectives, both methodologically, in terms of number of methods you use, and in terms of the number of sources you use. Do you remember that distinction between sources and methods? We've spoken about that. The source is who or what gives you the information, like the learner or the teacher or the book. And the method is how you get the information. Interviewing, document analysis, focus groups. Yeah?
In my case, I have used two methods, interviews and document analysis.
Okay.
Does that make it triangulation? Because there are some books that you read and you find out that they're saying more than one or more than two, and sometimes you are not sure.
Yes.
Which one is which?
I think that it just depends on the questions you're trying to answer and your purpose. So it's difficult to give an answer to you. For example, if you're trying to find out about learning in a classroom, there's a problem with only speaking to the teacher because the teacher might not tell you what's actually going, might not reflect what's happening in the classroom, right? So in that case, you'd interview the teacher, but also observe the classroom, and maybe also look at the learners' books or talk to the learners. So it depends on your focus. That will determine how you manage the triangulation of the sources and methods. Yeah.
Prof, I read one book.
Sorry, just carry on. Yeah.
I'm looking at examiners.
Yes.
National marks.
Okay. Yes. Yeah.
So I've used interviews.
Yes.
Interviewing these examiners, and also document analysis, looking at their reports, because they produce like examiners report.
Yes.
Each of every end of the year when they mark learners.
Yeah.
And they produce these reports. That's
Okay.
I looked at the report, and I also did interview with this.
Okay. Okay. So now I can't tell you if that's adequate or not, because I don't know what questions you're trying to answer. Right. So you don't have to tell me the questions now, but what's quite useful to do is to develop a table where you've got your research questions or questions in the one column, and then you've got your methods of data collection in the next column, and then you've got your methods of data analysis. Okay. And then you can track whether the methods are sufficient to answer the questions. Okay. So I think that's a good idea to develop that table for yourself, and then to check, if I'm asking this question, will these methods give me enough information to triangulate my answers to that question? Okay. Right. So, sorry, someone had a comment here? Yes.
I was trying to say there is triangulation within mixed method, that is qualitative and
Yes.
quantitative.
Yes.
There is also triangulation within the instrument.
Okay,
As she's
that's
saying,
right, yeah.
In my own case, I have done lesson observation, interviewed the teachers, and have collected some documents.
Yes.
So there is triangulation within the three instruments.
Yes. Good. Thank you for that. So triangulation can apply to the methods, or the sources, or the instruments.
Yeah.
Is someone at the back? Yes.
Yeah, and the research focuses on the teachers. Is it really necessary to interview the learners also?
Sorry, I didn't get the first part of the question.
The focus is on the teachers.
No, then it wouldn't be. Again, it depends on what your questions are about the teachers. Okay, but if your focus is on the teaching and the perceptions of the teachers, then you don't necessarily have to speak to the learners. But I would say that it would be useful to both interview the teachers and observe them, because what teachers say is not necessarily what they do. You see what I mean? Again, depending on your questions, your research questions. Okay, but in any case, some kind of triangulation would be useful. Okay, I'm going to move on now because we just ran out of time. We could spend a lot more time on case study, but let's shift on to narrative research now. And narrative inquiry focuses on people's stories. Okay, that's really the focus of narrative inquiry. Burke, Johnson, and Christensen talk about it as a study of experience when experience is understood as lived and told stories. Right. So you're getting at people's experience through their stories, through the stories that they live and tell. It's a collaboration between researchers and participants over time in a place or series of places and in social interaction with their social milieu. So again, with narrative research, the context is important because the story is embedded in a particular context. In this case, they talk about a social milieu. Okay. You'll see also from this quotation that the relationships are really important. If you're doing narrative research, the relationship between you and as a researcher and your participants is really fundamentally important. And you have to try and develop a relationship of trust so that they feel free in telling you their story. But if they don't really trust you, then you're not going to get much of a story from them, or they might not feel confident in sharing the story with you. Okay. Now you might ask, well, if narratives about stories, what's that got to do with research? Okay. Isn't research about doing experiments and putting on white coats? You know, how can you use stories in research? Okay, and some people have questioned that. So not all researchers accept narrative research as valid, right? But in a way, narrative research is a reaction against, positivism, which says that all research must be about experiments. It's saying that no, truth is not just about the object, but it's about this, also about the subject. So truth is about people's lived experience and the meaning they make of their experience. So that's where narrative research has roots in that understanding. That we can, if we get people to tell their stories, we get insight into their lives and their experiences and how they make meaning of their lives. And that's really valuable within a narrative inquiry. Does that make sense? Who's using narrative inquiry or some kind of narrative research? Okay. Some of you, okay. Right. So sometimes you can use narrative together with other methodologies. So you could use narrative in combination with case study as well. Because you might, say you do interviews of people, you might tell their stories as part of the case. Right. So say you're choosing some key participants within the case, and then you give a brief life story of that person and how their story relates to the case. That also might be a way of giving you insight into the case. So narrative is something you can combine with other things. So what is narrative? Narrative is a fundamental structure of human meaning making. That is, we think and perceive in narrative structures, and we understand the meaning of our lived experience through the process of storying. Narrative describes a way of knowing that's distinct from scientific knowing. I was making that distinction earlier, in which the focus is on meaning rather than fact, verisimilitude rather than logic. Okay, so it's giving you a different insight into the world compared to what an experiment would give you. Right, and that's the insight of people's lived experience, how they actually experience the world and make meaning of the world. Okay, and that's very important in education, because education is about relationships and interactions between people, and understanding people will help you to understand what's going on in education. Okay. Yes?
Just 1 second.
Okay. One slide back. Oh, sorry, I went forward there. Okay. Is that okay? Right, so we will send you the stuff, so don't worry if you haven't got every word. Right. So I just wanted to talk about stories here. You know, if you think about human beings, stories is a very ancient form of making meaning. Right. It's long before scientific experiments or surveys or anything like that. We've always told stories as human beings, long before we knew how to read and write. And that's the way that people have conveyed knowledge to the younger generation, and conveyed history and meaning to those who come after. So story is a very ancient way that human beings understand and make sense of reality, and we still do, and it's still a central way. You know, if you think about the everyday life, we're always telling stories. Oh, this is what happened to me on the way. You know, this is what so-and-so. If you listen to how people talk, they're always telling stories to each other. Okay, so stories is the way we make meaning of the world. Okay, even academics and researchers, you go and sit in the tea room. Right. They're often not talking about experiments and surveys. It's the gossip. Oh, you know what happened with the, they're telling a story. Okay, so stories is a very fundamental way of meaning making for human beings. And narrative recognizes it and says that's valuable for knowledge, for creating knowledge. Yes?
Prof, are you saying it carries a lot of bias?
Yes. Narrative research would recognize that research is about the subject in this particular approach. And that the subject is part of the research, including the biases and positions and so on. Again, it's about acknowledging those biases, and seeing them as providing valuable insight into the whatever you're investigating. Okay. Yes,
I
sir?
actually wanted to say, I'm like trying to think whether what I'm doing is a narrative. I mean, this is not my PhD.
Sure, yeah.
So something along
Yes.
which when I'm looking at the profiles of multilingualism.
Okay.
The language
Yes.
biographies and linguistic repertoires of university students.
Yeah.
Effects of a university student.
Yes.
This
Okay, yeah.
Where I'm looking for the narratives and
Okay.
the stories of
Yes.
Xhosa speaking students who are
Yes.
typically coming from the rural areas and townships.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
ex-Monster schools.
Yes.
Like the ones who have been in schools where they were taught that while like in Xhosa, but yeah.
Yes.
So, but basically, I'm trying to get those narratives and the shift from the school to university and Stellenbosch
Yes.
University.
Good,
So
yeah.
I'm trying to find out if that will actually count as a narrative.
Yes, yeah, it sounds like it would definitely. So you're looking at isiXhosa students who come from township or rural schools, and you asking them to tell you the stories of that transition from school to university. Yeah, so that would be a narrative inquiry approach would be very appropriate for that. Okay, so it's especially useful for trying to understand the way people experience change, you know, and how they understand and make meaning of change. So that's a good example of it. Thank you. Right. The purpose of narrative inquiry, to explore and conceptualize human experience as it is represented in textual form. Okay, so again, this is a fairly basic definition, but you can see the emphasis there. Explore, right? But not just explore, conceptualize. So you're trying to make sense of it. And experience, the way people's experience and the way that it's represented in textual form. Because we never have direct access to people's experience. They tell us about the experience, or it's represented in some way, and typically through their stories. Okay. So the textual form would mean in the form of a written story or of an interview, a transcribed interview, or in form of some kind of visual representation. Sometimes people might draw a river of life or something like that to show visually, or they might take photographs which represent their story in some way. But it's so text in the broader sense of some kind of construction, whether it's oral or written or visual. Okay. Narrative is good for getting people to tell their stories, okay, obviously, but understanding how people make meaning of their lived experiences. Right. Again, there's quite a few different kinds of narrative research. For example, autobiographical would be you telling your own story. Right, so there might be an overlap between autobiographical and autoethnography. Right, especially if you're writing your own story up. There would be an autobiographical evidence. Biographical would be when you're writing other people's stories. Typically, they're life stories. Life history approach, again, it's about a person's telling a person's story, but relating their story to a particular event or institution or something like that. So that's where there might be an overlap between narrative and case study. So, for example, say you're doing a case study of a college, and then you also interview some of the college participants to get their life stories, and then see how their life story links with this particular moment of the college, right, and how it's changed or them or not. Okay, so that's the life history. Life history, finding out their story in relation to a particular moment or aspect. And then you can also have organizational stories. So the story of a particular organization or a particular institution. And, Stellenbosch is its 100th anniversary, so they're bringing out a big book about the history of Stellenbosch, which is a kind of organizational narrative. Okay, so you can have many different kinds of narratives. Right. Methods. Typically, the narrative inquiry uses open-ended interviews. Right. So the interview is really central to the whole thing. And quite often, you wouldn't use only one interview. You would interview a person several times. Maybe the first interview would be just getting a bit, their biographical information. And then the second interview, going in depth into the themes you want to explore. And then the third interview, to explore questions and issues that arise from the first two. Okay. So you can see the depth of that. It's kind of the iterations. You repeat the interview and you build a level of trust, and each interview goes a bit deeper. Right, so you spend a lot of time with the person. Now, one of my students did a narrative inquiry of an adult learner who was an older person, and she interviewed her 5 or 6 times. Right. So each time deepening the interview, exploring various additional aspects of her life. Okay. So again, narrative, you can choose one or more respondents, but usually it wouldn't be a lot. Okay, not too many, because that would mean you don't get the depth. Okay. Yes? Yes. Yes, so if you wanted to understand the life story of, so it's a musician who grew up in a poor circumstances and then became famous, something like that. Yes, yeah. So if you wanted to understand that person's life and how they make meaning of their life and what they've learnt, for example, then narrative inquiry would be a very good approach to use. Yeah. Okay. And then it would involve interviews would be the foundation method, but you might complement that with some other methods. So you might ask him, for example, to show you some photographs, or you might go and visit his house and see, what his house looks like. So interviews, you can use other methods too, sort of supplement what you're getting from the interview. And of course, if someone is, sometimes you do a narrative inquiry on someone who's passed away, then you couldn't interview, but you could use other kinds of records. You could interview people who knew the person, or you could use photographs or their writings, and so on. Okay. And then typically the way that you'd analyze it could be the same thematic content analysis. But you can use other methods as well, like you can do literary analysis. You can analyze a person's story in terms of characters, theme, plot, conflict, and so on. Discourse analysis, the kinds of language that they use within their story. For example, medical language, musical language, metaphors, and so on. So there's different ways of analyzing depending on your purpose and your research questions. Okay. Key considerations for narrative research. When you doing narrative research, you have to remember that it's not like a window where you're looking out through the interview into a person's life. It's never transparent because the person's always constructing their own narrative. And when you take that person's narrative, and then you reconstructing it for a different purpose. So it's always mediated. Do you understand what I mean by that? If you just think about it, say a friend asks you about your own life. You'll tell a certain story to that person whom you trust. Okay. Then say your doctor asks you your story. You might tell a different story. You see what I mean? And then say it's a long-lost relative who you don't really know, and they ask you about your life. You might tell a different kind of story. Right. So your story depends on who's asking you, and who they are, and what their purpose is. So we have to recognize that in narrative research. that the participant is always constructing their narrative for you, and that might be different for than for other people. So there's not an absolute truth in narrative research, right? It's always constructed and co-constructed, because first of all you get their narrative, then you are writing it up for your own research and reconstructing it. Right, so that's an important point. You can't just think that the narrative equals the truth. You see what I mean? Yeah. Yes?
I was just going to say, so there could be many untruths
Yes.
in the subliminal text.
It could be, yeah. It could be. There could be many untruths and many truths. You see what I mean? And the purpose of narrative is not to get the truth, okay, but it's to get insight into the way that person makes meaning of their life. Okay, so that's the difference. So even the untruths are interesting, you see, because it's telling you something about how they understand their own life and how they present their life to other people. Okay, yes?
I want to know, my study is about identity formation.
Yes.
And so if I use narratives, is it okay to frame the narratives by saying, okay, to tell your story through the frame of belonging or the frame of recognition? Is that okay? Or are you then pushing the participant in a specific direction?
No, I think that, I think your research questions would probably reflect those interests, so how does the person's story reflect their identity or whatever. I think sometimes you have to be quite careful how you strategize around asking questions, because it might not be the best question to say, how does your narrative reflect your identity? You see what I mean? I mean, the person might think, what? I don't know what you're talking about. But it might be, if you reformulate the questions in a way as prompts that will help the person to tell you. So for example, you might say, who are the people who influenced you most? You see what I mean? So there, you're getting a lot about the identity, but you're not asking them directly about the identity. Or you might say, how do you feel you changed when you moved from school to college? Again, it's all about identity, but it's framed in a way that's much easier to tell a story about. Okay. So once you've formulated your research questions, you need to think of how will you operationalize those questions in your interview schedule in a way that's going to enable the person to tell their story. Okay. That's going to be quite a challenge. Right. Good. So I think that's one of the key considerations that you've raised there. Thank you for that. Voice. So when you're presenting when you're writing up the research, you need to think about, do I present the story in the first person, in other words, using their voice, or do I put it in the third person? She said that, she did this, and so on. Right. And there's advantages and disadvantages of both of those, but that's a really important question. Okay. Even if you put it in the first person, you're still constructing that or reconstructing their narrative. So you mustn't try and fool yourself that somehow it's a transparent narrative. It's always constructed, whatever choice you make about voice. The audience, again, I was telling you about audience. Your story changes according to who you tell it to. So you have to think about that. Ownership, who owns the story? Once you've got the story from the person, and once you've transcribed and written it up, it's important to show them and let them comment on it, add or change it. Because in a way it is their story, even though you're using it for research purposes. So you need to think about the ethics and ownership around narrative as well. And then again, the context, of course, the context always shapes the story. When you're doing narrative inquiry, the story is often about other stories. So say my student was interviewing an older adult learner. By interviewing her, she was also finding out about the bigger story in which she grew up and went to school and became an adult. So a story always reflects other stories. Could be the stories of other people who are related to that person, or it could be the story of the country or the city or whatever. Okay. A story is always a story of stories, and it's important to think about what those stories are. And then finally, truth and confirmability. We raised the issue earlier about what if a person's not telling the truth, whatever the truth is in this case. You can use multiple sources again. You can use photo albums, interview other people, but again, the point is it's not a court case, right? We're not trying to test the evidence in order to reach a decision about the guilt or otherwise. It's more about trying to understand the meaning making of that person. Okay, yes?
Is that where authenticity comes in as well? How do you test authenticity?
Yes, that would be a key issue, and using different methods and different sources will help you with that. Okay, but again, authenticity means something different in narrative research to what it would mean in, say, an experimental design. Okay,
Prof,
yeah.
how then do we avoid objectification?
Tell me what you mean by objectification.
Say you are doing research and you end up objectifying the person or the persons that you focus on.
Yes.
Or whose narratives are supposed to shape your research.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I think in one sense, you are going to end up with an object in the sense of a thesis and a story in the thesis. Okay, but I think the process is really crucial. And that's why I said the relationship is so important. Right. So it's important to establish a relationship of trust, and then to explain clearly the purpose of the research, and to share that narrative with the person. So there's a sense of co-constructing it. So you once you've transcribed it and written it up, you ask them to check it, and then once you've taken the transcription and put it into a narrative, you share it again with them to get their comments and feedback on it. Okay. Recognizing that it's a research study, so there's there's a tension there which you have to negotiate with the person. Okay. Yeah. You have to attend quite carefully to the ethics of it, and explain very clearly, go through the process of informed consent with the person, and then have some kind of checking process as you're going along with the narrative. Okay. Often it's a delicate thing because persons, if you're getting rich information, they're sharing sensitive information with you, which you have to work out how to deal with in consultation with them. Okay. So issues around confidentiality and anonymity are really very important. Okay. Right. I think let's see how we're doing for time. 11:11. Okay, so we're just about exactly on time. Okay. Are there any other questions about narrative research?
I just wanted to find out, how do you distinguish between objectivity and subjectivity in narrative?
Sure. Okay, the narrative research is kind of aligned with an interpretivist type of paradigm, usually. Okay. So that would be a paradigm which says that knowledge is created or co-created or constructed by subjects. Right. So there wouldn't be a problem in acknowledging the subjectivity of knowledge and data within that paradigm. And people within that paradigm would question whether there's any such thing as pure objectivity. Let's say everything is subjective or intersubjective. People create or co-create knowledge. So, although it's important to check the narrative and use multiple sources in order to enrich the narrative, you're not going to arrive at an objective account. I think people working within narrative inquiry would say, we don't understand what you mean by that. You see why I'm saying that? because they understand that knowledge is created by subjects or co-created by subjects. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah?
Prof, I'm beginning to realize that I'm using a case study.
Yes.
But the moment you start talking about open-ended interviews,
Yes.
I also have them.
Okay.
It means
Yes.
that I'm borrowing a bit of narrative information there. But my question is, the way you're explaining it,
Yes.
it's like an interview is not a once-off thing. You have to cascade it according to levels.
Yes.
Looking at how you're addressing your research question.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the idea is, at the end of the interview, we have to give you what we are looking for
Yes.
from the participant to answer your research questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a bit of a problem then coming up with a good interview.
Okay.
Good interview questions.
Can I just
And
say
the
that?
levels in which you can actually
Yeah.
downscale them.
Okay, I think we can't say that interview kind of is you can use an interview in many different approaches. Okay, from mixed methods to narrative to case study to phenomenological whatever. It's really the purpose of the interview will maybe differ according to the approach and your research questions and your purpose. So within a case study, the interview, maybe the main purpose of the interview would be to help you understand the case, right? The particular case that you're looking at, right? Whereas in a narrative inquiry, the purpose of the interview is to help you understand that person's story. Okay, so the purposes are different, and that means that you might conduct the interview in different ways. So say in narrative inquiry, you might conduct several interviews with the same person, and each time going at a different level, as I was saying. Whereas in case study, typically you just interview a person once because you've got multiple interviews with different stakeholders of the case. Okay. And then again, the questions will differ because the purpose and focus is different. Okay. Right. Anybody else want to comment? So who was using narrative? Somebody? Do you have a sense now that what is your sense of a narrative approach now? Now that we've gone through the session, do you feel that you've got some insights or? Yes.
To be honest with you, I'm confused.
Okay. Right.
Because I can see aspects of. I felt quite strongly that there's a big part of my study is a case study.
Okay.
But I can also see the importance of the narrative.
Yes.
So I have to make a decision about
Okay.
whether it is a combination of both. But I think my limitation is that I thought I understood what a case study is and I don't understand it.
Okay.
So I need to process what you've told me today.
Yes.
And see what that plays out for me.
Okay.
But that's not because you've confused me.
No, I don't mind confusing you. I'm quite pleased if I confuse you. I think that confusion is a really uncomfortable feeling, but often it's not a bad thing because it can help you to question again some of your previous thoughts and assumptions, and then that can lead you to a deeper understanding. Okay. I think what might be useful is to try and define clearly what is your unit of analysis. So what is the thing that you're investigating? And then if it's a person, then it lends more towards narrative. Okay? But if it's an institution or some other kind of thing, then case study fits better with that, although you might use some narrative within that. Okay, so again I said you can use narrative research within other approaches to complement or enrich them. So you can think about that. Okay. Right. Okay, I think we're going to have a tea break now. I just want to welcome Professor Davids. Thank you very much for coming. And after tea, we're going to have a session on mixed methods research. Right, welcome back to the people who attended the survey and quantitative and experimental design. So we've covered 4 methods now between the 2 sessions, and we've been going at quite a gallop. So we haven't been able to do it in a lot of depth, but I hope at least it gives you an overview of the particular approach, and then if you're using that approach, some ideas about for your own study, but also if you're not using it, some ideas about how it's used by others, and when you're reading, you'll know what they're talking about, hopefully. Okay. So what we're going to do in this last part of today's program is we're going to look at 2 additional or 3 additional approaches. The one is called the mixed methods approach, and I'll be leading that, and Prof Le Grange will chip in as we're going along. And then we'll shift to policy and conceptual studies with Professor Davids. And she'll do that for about 45 minutes from 12 o'clock, and then we'll just have a short conclusion. Right. The policy and conceptual studies, we thought that would be useful for us to do all together, because all of you are in some ways using concepts and probably would refer to some policies, even though you might not be studying them as your object of inquiry. So we felt that would be useful just to get a sense of how that approach works. Right, so let's move on to mixed methods. As we've mentioned earlier, mixed methods is an approach that in which the investigator gathers both quantitative and qualitative data and integrates the two, and then draws interpretations based on the combined strengths of both sets of data. Okay. So I think mixed methods comes out of this idea of 2 different kinds of data. Because in the past, there's been huge debates between people who followed qualitative approaches and others who preferred quantitative approaches. And people refer to this as paradigm wars. There was a lot of strife between those in these 2 different camps, quantitative and qualitative camps. I think we've moved beyond that now. So we don't talk about qualitative and quantitative as paradigms anymore. Okay, we talk about them more as kinds of data, types of data, and how you analyze the data. Okay, so I think that's really important, an important difference. So you might use quantitative and qualitative data within a whole range of paradigms. Okay, but it's more about the data and how you analyze it and use it. Okay. Now we have talked about that previously, qualitative data and quantitative data. Let's just remind ourselves about that. So if we're talking about qualitative data, what are we talking about? Can someone just help us with that? Okay. Right. So remember, interviews is the method, eh? But interviews do tend to generate qualitative data. Yeah. But so what form does qualitative data take? Yeah, text, or typically words. Eh? So people, whereas, if you're doing survey, you were talking about that in the other session. Eh? Surveys can generate both kinds of data, but often they would generate more quantitative data. Okay, so in the form of numbers. So that's the basic distinction. And there's people have critiqued that as well. But it's a useful starting point when you're talking about mixed methods, I think. Okay. Right, so mixed methods researchers would say it's valuable to use both qualitative and quantitative data because they give you different kinds of insights into a particular situation. Right. So they would say, look, let's not separate them. Both of them are valuable. They would try and integrate the two in order to understand a particular problem or situation. And they would try and use the combined strengths of the 2 kinds of data and 2 forms of analysis. Okay, right. As I was saying earlier, often mixed method is linked to a pragmatist paradigm. You know, it's a paradigm that sees has an emphasis on pragmatic solutions to problems. So you use what works rather than starting with an ideological position. Okay, although in a way that is ideological. Right. So the purpose of mixed methods would be to understand in an integrated way a problem or situation which has both quantitative and qualitative and quantitative dimensions. Okay. So, for example, say you're looking at the issue of, we were talking earlier about the issue of learners who speak one language at home and they're doing home language in another language at school. Right. So if we're looking at a mixed methods approach there, you could gather different kinds of data which would illuminate that situation. So, for example, if you looked at it from a quantitative point of view, you might look at how many learners there are from those kinds of backgrounds in the classroom. And you might also look at how are those learners performing. So you see, you'd look at the numbers, the marks, and that kind of thing. Attendance registers, classroom registers, reports, all of that would give you quantitative data. Right. But then you can also find out what is it like to experience that. So you might go and talk to those learners, do focus groups, get them to write pictures or other methods where they can express their perspectives on the issue. Right. So then you have both quantitative and qualitative data, and then you could analyze and interpret it and combine it in order to understand more deeply what's going on in that situation. Does that make sense? Okay. Right. Prof, is that okay? Anything you want to add there?
Yes, so the very few good examples of mixed method studies, because what often happens is people combine two separate studies, which is a sort of neo-positivist quantitative study with, with a interpretive qualitative study. And so you don't actually find integration happening, and that's where the big challenge is. And so I mean, yeah, what you were saying is correct, because if you look at it qualitative and quantitative from a paradigmatic perspective, you're actually looking at neo-positivism and interpretivism. And then there are clashes at paradigmatic level. So it's helpful to say that what must drive the research is the kind of questions you ask. So there should be questions that will lead you to produce both qualitative and quantitative data. Okay.
I think that's very useful and important, and it links to our earlier point. If you remember, this morning we were talking about how the purpose and the research questions needs to inform our decision about approach, right? So I think that's really especially important in mixed methods. That you must make sure that mixed methods are appropriate for the questions and the purpose that you're adopting. And then again, the key question there is how do you combine it? And I think we'll go on to that in a moment. So mixed methods approach is good for obtaining different perspectives, right? Also obtaining more comprehensive view of a problem. So some mixed methods researchers would say these things are not in competition, the qualitative and quantitative. You can combine them to get a deeper understanding of a particular situation, or more comprehensive. It's also good for conducting preliminary exploration with individuals in preparation for a quantitative study. So sometimes you can start with the qualitative, maybe with a few interviews to get a sense of what the issues or problems are, and then that might help you to design a survey, especially when you don't know much about the problem. Okay, so you can do it that way around, or you can do it another way around, where you can deepen quantitative research, for example, a survey, by conducting follow-up qualitative interviews. Right. So say you survey 50 or 100 people, and then you generate some quantitative data from that. And then in order to get a deeper insight, maybe you choose 5 or 10 of those people in order to explore the issues in a more detailed way. And in that way, you get some of the breadth of the problem as well as some depth in understanding the problem. Okay, often it's used in that way in the studies that I've seen. Right. So there's different types of mixed methods research. And you can see they've got different names. The one is called a convergent design, and that would be collecting both quantitative and qualitative data, analyzing both data sets, and merging the results. So sometimes case study does do that, you know. So you're interviewing people and getting qualitative data, but you're also looking at some quantitative records about the case, and then you bring together that data to answer questions about, for example, what is the impact of the case, or how effective is it, or what is the experience of people within that case. Okay. Right, so that would be convergent, meaning it's converging, meaning it's coming together. The quantitative and qualitative data is coming together to help you answer those particular research questions. Right, then the other two are sequential, which means you do the one before the other one. Okay, so the explanatory sequential design, you collect the quantitative data first and then the qualitative data to explain. Okay, so say, for example, you do a survey, and you were talking about survey in the other stream, and maybe your survey is on, political attitudes and how they've changed, right? So it would be questions like, who did you vote for? Are you going to vote for the same party this election? That kind of thing, right? So there you'd get statistics. So a certain percentage say this and that and that and that, and then in order to try and explain that, you would then do the explanatory part of the research, which you'd follow up with maybe interviews or focus groups to get the qualitative data. Okay, so in that case, you generate the numbers, and then you collect the words to explain the numbers. Okay, that would be that kind of sequence.
Can I just say something?
Yes, please.
So I'm trying to highlight the sort of bad examples. So you get bad examples where people think that they're doing the sequential type of mixed method studies, where somebody actually does a survey design, and there are closed-ended questions, and towards the end there are 1 or 2 open-ended questions, and they call that mixed methods. And that remains a survey design. So there must be balance, and it's not necessarily going to be 50-50, but there needs to be balance between what is quantitative and qualitative in these kind of studies. So there are examples where people think it's mixed methods, and I've seen examples of that, but it's really a survey design.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, so a survey can generate both quantitative and qualitative data, but that wouldn't mean that it's a mixed methods. I think that's the important point. So you need to have, several different methods which are focusing on different kinds of data, and then thinking carefully about what the relation is between those different methods and different kinds of data, and how those relate to your research questions. Remember we talked about that table, where you put your research question, the method, the kind of data, and then try and plot that across the table. I think that's very useful when you're thinking about any research, but especially mixed methods. Right. Okay, so that was the second one would be the explanatory sequential design. Right, so there you're using the qualitative data to try and explain what you found in the quantitative data. Okay. Then the other one, exploratory sequential design, first exploring the problem by gathering qualitative data, then using the findings to build a second quantitative phase of the research. Right, so there you might be researching something you don't know that much about, You explore the issue first, maybe by interviewing some people who know about it, gathering qualitative data about that, and then from there using that to maybe design a survey where you broaden out the research to collect, say, more quantitative data on that. Right, so you can do it both ways round, or together. Right. So there's a number of different options there. Are there any questions about that so far? Right. So if you're reading research in your particular area and they say this study adopted a mixed methods design, then you'll know what they're talking about. Yeah? Right. So and then they might elaborate exactly what the design looked like. It was a convergent design. It was explanatory sequential or exploratory sequential. Then you know they're doing this first and then that, or this first and then that. Okay. Right. Okay. So the typical methods then for qualitative, again, it's similar to what we were discussing earlier. You'd use interviews, observations, document analysis, focus groups to generate the qualitative side, and then quantitative, often surveys or some kind of experimental design. Okay. Yeah, and I think that the danger with this is thinking that I think the issue that Prof Le Grange raised, methods, you can't say interview equals qualitative or survey equals quantitative. Because you can generate quantitative data from surveys, interviews as well as qualitative data. So for example, say you interview somebody and then you count how many times they say evaluation. You're doing a quantitative analysis of the data from an interview. You see that? And then you use the same data and you do a thematic analysis of it. Then it's more a qualitative type of analysis. So it's a problem to just equate a method with qualitative or quantitative, and I think that's part of the problem when you're thinking about mixed methods. Okay. Right. So typical methods of data analysis: statistical analysis of quantitative, and thematic analysis of qualitative. But again, you can do many other kinds of analysis, especially of the qualitative. And then right, then some of the key considerations, and I think we started to talk about that earlier. The rationale for mixed methods. I think you need to be really clear about why you're deciding to adopt a mixed methods approach. Okay? And that means you need to be clear about your purpose and your questions and how the methods you use are going to help you answer the questions and achieve the purpose. So as you're not trying to achieve multiple purposes or two different research projects within the same research. Okay. And then another challenge is integrating the data. How do you do it? How do you integrate it meaningfully rather than just having two studies? So that's also a real challenge where you have to work out how you present the data and how you're going to link the qualitative and quantitative analysis of the data. Okay. Is anybody doing a mixed methods research? Are you? Okay. Right. So just put up your hand. Hi. Okay. So can you just tell us, when you look at those types of mixed methods, convergent and then explanatory, sequential, and exploratory? Are you doing explanatory, sequential? Just tell us briefly how you're going to do that.
So first, my students will do a computer-based program to determine their increase in reading speed as well as comprehension. Okay. And afterwards, I'm going to do a survey to explain more about the results or the findings.
Okay. So which one is quantitative and which one is qualitative?
So I think the computer program is not quite. Confused.
Okay.
And the survey will be open-ended and structural questionnaire. So.
Okay. So again, in that case, I think it would be useful, maybe you've done this already, but to develop a table where you have your research questions and then your methods and the kind of data that they will generate, and try and track across to see how it links. Because I think that's one of the big challenges is the combination and the coherence of it. Okay, thank you. And in your study?
I started with the idea of conversion design,
yes,
collecting both.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
my first phase was the survey, sending out the survey to the students.
Yes, yeah.
And then got all the information, but I had 3 open-ended questions. But that was still part of my quantitative research.
Okay.
So out of the open-ended questions or answers, there came a lot. So I had about a month after I visited the submissions, and I've changed a little bit, and it came to explanatory sequence, and then asked only 9 questions for the academics.
Okay.
So to focus and more, and to, although there was 40 questions in the survey,
yeah,
ask 9 questions where there was problems or so just to get a deeper answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So you started with the survey, and then that generated both quantitative and qualitative data, right? And then you took the qualitative data, and then used that to generate, say, to help you develop an interview schedule or something.
Yeah, protocol, just to get more in-depth.
More in-depth information from the academics.
Yeah,
right. So that would be an explanatory sequential design. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Collect the quantitative first. Well, you collected both first, and then you took the qualitative and then developed a second instrument to get more in-depth insight into the problem. Okay. So again, it's just about thinking, how do you combine that data, and how do you link it to your research questions? So again, that table will help you with doing that. Yeah. Good. Yeah. And then someone else had their hand up around. Who else? Yeah. Tell us.
I'm not sure if Prof will be able to answer it this morning, or maybe I'll just ask later at individual, but maybe I should ask.
Sure, please, go ahead.
Like, I'm not really sure whether I'm going to have a mixed approaches.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe if I can say my problem will be able to help me.
Okay.
Yeah. So, like, my title is Teaching for Retention in Senior Secondary Mathematics.
Teaching for Retention in Senior Secondary Mathematics.
The
Okay.
reason is learners forget mathematics content.
Okay.
So maybe different. Now, what I'm going to do, the data that I'm going to collect is interviewing the different teachers at different senior secondary schools.
Okay.
The strategies that they use, like as a way to retain learners.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean the content.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like in mathematics, mnemonics and other strategies that they use for the learners to retain the information.
Okay. Right.
Now, the kind of data that I think might be kind of quantitative is not really that a lot. Besides only me maybe providing a proof that yes, like in our country, Namibia, learners are struggling with mathematics content, and that maybe by providing, for example, proof from NIED or DNA and the final year exams results.
Yes.
In the statistics,
Yes.
how it has shown the results in mathematics
Yeah.
previous year, past
Yeah.
few years.
Yes.
So that is the only kind of quantitative data I think that is going to be involved in my research.
Okay.
Now, am I going to explain my, am I going to tell that my research is mixed, or am I only going to use qualitative?
Okay. I think it just depends on the research questions that you're trying to answer. Okay. Because if you're trying to answer, it's a question like what are good strategies for learner retention of whatever knowledge that then that's more like you're going to perhaps interview and observe best practices around that, which is more like a qualitative data. But if your question is around what are the problems of retention, and then that might involve some sort of analysis of results or exams, which generates the quantitative data.
So what you mean is my research is more qualitative?
Well, it depends on your research questions and what you want to find out. Okay.
Actually, I just want to collect different strategies.
Yes.
That's all.
Okay.
I think I need to prove my point that it's true the learners, the performance in mathematics is.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So again, so what I would suggest is that you once you've formulated your research questions, you think about what methods are going to help you answer those particular questions, and then what data will the data be quantitative or qualitative in nature, and that'll help you think more about that. Okay. So I think we won't be able to finalize the answer.
The moment the
yeah.
qualitative data is involved in my research, doesn't that make it obvious that I should have both?
No, it's not obvious. It depends on your research purpose and questions.
So in your literature, if your literature is based on a quantitative research, it does mean that your research method have to include that.
No, it doesn't.
So your literature says that the students is not doing well in maths, and that is based on results. That is quantitative. But your research method is going to be qualitative because you're going to go and ask the methods the teachers use. You understand?
Okay, we just have to stop there because we're running out of time. But I hope you've got some ideas too, and you can always talk afterwards. Okay, thank you for your input. So let's have last point, and then we need to go on to Prof Davids.
Okay, I just want to get back to JC's example.
Sure. Yeah.
Because the question is, what are we mixing? In mixed methods research, and I've asked the experts in this field internationally, and they struggle with answering that question. But JC is actually mixing two designs. And is that mixed methods research? Because JC is doing an experimental or quasi-experimental design,
right,
and a survey design in one study.
Yeah.
So are we mixing paradigms? We said no, we're not mixing paradigms. Are we mixing methods? Are we mixing data? Are we mixing designs? Maybe JC can create a new way of understanding mixed methods.
Okay. Well, I think we'll make a slot for JC to report back on his new mixed methods paradigm. And but I think at least we've got an idea of some of the current understandings and also questions around mixed methods. And I want us to move on now to Prof Davids, who's going to talk about conceptual and policy studies.
It's a bit somber in here, hey? I'm not quite sure if it's the weather outside or whether JC's account of mixed methods. It was all panicking. I'm worried about JC's mixed methods. Okay, so it would help to tell you that my background is in philosophy. So whatever I'm going to be saying to you will be from that perspective. It's important for you to understand where people come from when they speak to you about things.
Is that right?
Yes, let me just find it. So while we are waiting, I want you just to, some of you look like you are slipping away. So turn to the person next to you. And in case you haven't spoken to the person next to you yet for today, you all know each other. Yeah, so you're comfortable, right? So find a partner. Oh, see, they don't know each other. She moved, right? Oh, she moved. That you excuse me. Right. So I want to know what this word analysis means, please. Analysis. Yes, analysis. What is the meaning of analysis? That's not an understanding, eh? A word we use every day. That's not going to tell me. That's it.
Take it apart, think about it, talk about it. We break it.
Okay, have we come to some sort of understanding? No? Now, typically, as you learners in your class, you look down when I try to make eye contact with you. Right, so let me pick on unsuspecting soul. What did you say analysis is?
Analysis could be trying to take meaning to data collected.
To make meaning of data that I am collecting. Okay. And what does it mean to make meaning of something? Okay, very eager to help you. Yes. To understand. Okay, yeah. So I'm trying to make meaning. I'm trying to understand. Anything else come up in conversations? Bridget? Bridget's trying to impress me because I haven't seen her for months. I'm shocked to see her here. So now she's trying to redeem herself for offering explanation. Yes. What does analysis mean?
How to interpret things.
And what does interpret mean? To make sense. Okay, so we're back to making sense. Okay? Now, one of the first things that you should actually be thinking now is that means that if I'm making sense of something and I'm trying to give meaning to something, then I bring myself into that, isn't it? Yeah? So I bring who I am into that word, isn't it? So if I say to you, winter, and some of you go, oh, I don't like winter, it's cold, it's miserable outside. And some of you will say, no, actually my favorite time of year, I like snuggling up with the fire, and some hot chocolate, and all these associations will come into your head, isn't it? So that should tell you that the words and the terms that we work with are all open to different kinds of meanings. Are you with me so far? Okay. So that means we're in a bit of a mess, aren't we? Because that means that there's absolutely no such thing as definitive and certainty. And this need, I got it earlier when I popped in here, this thing for objectivity, it doesn't exist in the social sciences. You're not going to get it. Because you and I can conduct the same research, chat to the same people, ask the exact same questions, and I will come back with my set of findings, and you will come back with your set of findings. So the research we do is entirely subjective, and everything is open to interpretation. Okay? Are we clear so far? So if you get that, then we're halfway where we need to be. Okay? See, it's not as difficult as JC has made it out to be. Right. Okay, so the first thing I want to warn you against, and I say this to all students, is please forget about going to your dictionaries. Please forget and do not use Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not a legitimate research source. Okay? I hope you understand that. Everybody can go onto that site and know whatever they want to, and sometimes if you read the nonsense that's on there, you should be running away from it as soon as possible, right? So Wikipedia, yes ma'am?
Can you make it a little bit?
You're asking me to do something which I cannot do, you see? Peter?
But is that in what format is that?
It's a PowerPoint.
No? Well, then you must go out and enlarge it. Yeah, no, you must enlarge it.
What's your name? Yes. So I can pick on you later?
It's Ria.
Ria.
Pick on my knee if you want to.
No, I'm going to make it bigger for you. Is that?
Thank you. I'm a little bit old.
No, that's fine. We're all old, so that's fine. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah? Oh, okay, it is better. Okay. So steer clear of Wikipedia. Do not write in your thesis, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the word education means the following. Okay, you're shooting yourself in the head immediately, right? Because we don't operate like that. We work with concepts. We work with ideas. We work with making meaning. And every time we work with these words, we bring ourselves into that conversation all the time. So even simple thing like what is education if I ask each one of you, you're going to give me an entirely different understanding of what that is, right? So every time that's why it's so important when you start on your research, no matter what kind of study you're going to do, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, mixed method, whatever study, empirical, conceptual, and some people think, well, I'm doing empirical study, I don't have to work with concepts. That's not true. Any study requires of you to make sense of the concepts with which you are working. Make sense? So give me some ideas of what you're working with. Just throw like one word, keywords from your research out at me.
Instructional leadership.
Instructional leadership, right? What else do we have?
Grade retention.
Say again.
Grade retention.
Grade retention. Grade retention, yeah. What else do we have?
Student disengagement.
Say again.
Student disengagement.
Student disengagement. So those are all loaded terms. If you look at instructional leadership, automatically, leadership. What do we associate leadership with? Now some of you might say principles, and then I will say, no, that's not true. Leadership is not confined to a principle. So automatically it's a disputed term, isn't it? Then automatically the next thing is, what kind of leadership are you talking about? What is the context of the leadership you're talking about? Right? Then you say instructional. What's instructional? So what I'm trying to show to you, grade retention, retain what? Retain the learner or retain the grade? Retain the learning, retain the teaching. Repeat the same thing. What are you talking about? So what am I doing? I'm trying to show you that you create your own meaning, and therefore it's imperative that from the outset when you start your study, you have to identify your key concepts. And then for the purposes of your study, you actually have to state as such, for the purposes of this study or the purposes of this paper, whatever you're going to call it, I'm going to use these concepts, and within this study it's going to be understood as follows. That's the level you actually have to go at. Because in one essay it's going to be understood as such, and in another way. Make sense to you? Yeah? So it's important for you to clarify. Now, you have to make sure that you understand this is not about seeking definitions, and it's not about creating certainty. It's about establishing the parameters of your particular study. So you will say, I'm going to work with a particular concept or understanding of feminism, for example, but I'm going to understand it with a particular African philosophy understanding, whatever you can do. But you're establishing the parameters of that study. And that's important, because that you're going to need in formulating the research question and how you intend to approach the research. It will also help you to understand what exactly you hope to achieve through the study. Because that's all connected. Do you want to simply know whether your kids are reading faster? And then if they do, the question then becomes, so what? So what? So your kids read faster? So what? So you have to think what you're trying to do with these concepts. Now, one of the forms of analysis that we use in research is referred to conceptual analysis. Now, conceptual analysis in itself is broken down as well, but we won't go into those details. So for our purposes, what we need to understand about conceptual analysis is that it's about breaking down concepts in exactly the way that I've explained it to you right now. Taking certain things and simple words. So it's about making sense about what knowledge actually is, what meaning actually is. So things we take for granted. So you will say, I'm interested in the issue of values in education. And then you could say, I'm going to link this to policy, for example. Then you have to unpack not only what values mean in that study, but you also have to take into account that the whole idea of values is completely context bound, which then brings into question, for example, whether we can ever talk about universalist values. Can you see what I'm doing? Right? Then if you're telling me I'm looking at a policy document, then you have to go as far as saying, well, within this policy document, how is values understood? So it's about depth. It's about going down as opposed to going wide. Okay? Are there any questions so far about what? Yes?
Yes, I don't know any of these words, but or anything that we've said today, but is a conceptual analysis there, because now my brain needs to put it in boxes, otherwise I'm it's clearly not the paradigm, but is it now an approach or is it the method or is it none of that? Conceptual analysis as itself, is it the form of an approach or is it the form of a method of gaining insight?
Okay, so it's going to help you to make sense of the paradigm and the methods. And this is why sometimes I say to students, when you come to me with a research idea, then I will say to you, perhaps you should start by writing the abstract. Because now you've got to tell me, what is the problem? How do you think you're going to explore, understand, make sense? And what do you think, and how do you think you're going to get to that data? So in identifying the concepts, you're establishing how to go forward with the rest of your research. So very often when you have initial conversations with your supervisor, you are going to come to him or her with a particular research interest, isn't it? So what was your research interest, for example?
Whether in CA qualification we will engender socially just democratic citizens.
Whether in CA education we will engender socially just citizenship education.
Yeah.
So so automatically, how many concepts do you have now?
Well, there's a lot, because in citizenship, social justice, ethical leaders, in a sense, and accountants are supposed to drive the economy of the country.
Right, so you've got a lot of stuff going on, right? So for the purposes of your study, you are going to have to clarify for yourself what you understand by social justice, because that's a whole broad research arena. How you're going to limit it for this particular study, and then similarly what you understand by democratic citizenship, right? And then of course the whole issue of chartered accountants, right? And then of course within which context. Can you see? So it's about now, once you've established the parameters of what you've just told me, what is it that you wish to know? So what do you want to know?
I want to know whether we fail or succeed in tracking. Are we generating a professional that benefits the South African society, or just a better professional that makes more profit for himself?
Okay, so
can I put that? Can I rephrase that question and put it
for her?
For everybody.
Okay.
So let's assume it's not an empirical study. So is conceptual analysis a philosophical method in its own right? If it was just a philosophical study?
Yes.
I think.
Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yes.
So yeah. So I think that's helpful.
Yeah. So in your case, sorry, what's your name? Judith. In your case, you are going to be analyzing those concepts in order to make sense of whether indeed, when CAs have training, are they actually contributing to citizenship education, or are they only in their own pockets? It's an entirely conceptual study, am I correct? Yes. So yes, you can use it. But for what I've just said to you now, for the purposes of the general conversation, it's about establishing the parameters. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions on that? Right? So to pick up on Prof Le Grange points is that it is possible, as you would know by now, to embark on either what we call an empirical study. So you have to get some data and go out and do the field work and do exactly what Professor Rule was telling you early on. Or it's entirely possible to embark on what's called a conceptual study. In other words, you don't use any empirical data. It's more common, as I tell you here, to find the conceptual analysis within the philosophical inquiry. Right? So it's more commonly found in philosophy. Because in philosophy, we are interested in understanding concepts and making meaning of concepts. And for our particular purposes in this faculty, philosophy of or in education. So the people who's in, people like Zenobia, for example, is interested in understanding identity, and specifically this thing called a colored identity, and how that impacts upon her professional identity. So she's going to unpack the concepts, and she's adopting a conceptual framework that's philosophical, but she's also going to be using empirical data. So the two are not exclusive. So it's entirely possible to embark on conceptual analysis while also embarking on empirical analysis. Okay? What I want to emphasize is that any research study requires that you clarify your concepts. That's regardless of what study you are doing. So whether it's empirical, whether it's quantitative, mixed method, whatever you're going to be doing, your starting point, certainly in your proposal, there has to be a section where you talk about your key concepts. How do you understand the concepts that you are using? Are we all clear on that? Okay? There onwards, you will then decide for yourself. The information that I seek to understand, or what I'm trying to make sense of here, is it going to be better for me to embark on an empirical study or not? That's something else. Making sense to you? Yeah? So, it's about getting basic understandings of particular words, particular terms, making sense of meaning. But often what students don't take into account, very often the big stumbling block, is this thing called context. Every single thing that you do, every single thing that you are going to write about, you have to take into account context. So if you talk about leadership, for example, it's a loaded term, because a leadership practices in one school or in one institution will be entirely different to how it's going to be in another. Does that make sense to you? Why? Because the context defines. And you cannot be dismissive of the fact that very often concepts are given meaning through the context in which they find themselves. So for example, you will say to me, school culture. And some of you will go, oh, our school culture is we have a particular color code and we sing the school song and we have whatever, we have sporting codes and we have initiations and this is our culture, this defines who we are and this is how we look and this is how we conduct ourselves. And others will go, no, in a school culture we don't have one. We have a very poor school because we're a dysfunctional school. And we have no sense of urgency for what we're doing. Can you see how a word like culture takes on entirely different meanings in terms of where you are at? So your context has to be clarified, regardless of whatever research you are doing. And specifically, of course, it's an African context. We can't talk about a singular South African context either. Right? Because as you and I both know, there are major disparities within this landscape, which you have to clarify because they impact on the concepts that you are using. Make sense? I'll go into a bit more detail when I get to the policy bit. So this ties into your conceptual framework. And I know students often struggle with this thing called a conceptual framework. So before you look at what I'm saying here, what is a conceptual framework? Let me make this bigger. While I make it bigger, chat to a friend quickly. What is a conceptual framework? You're not talking to Okay, any luck? Who's going to be brave? What's the conceptual framework? Brave souls, where are you? Conceptual framework at the back, you look very happy. You found out, yes, tell us.
I did fine.
You did it?
Our last session, Professor Rule said something about it.
And what did he say? What do you remember him saying?
Well, we did the conceptual versus the theoretical. And the conceptual you can draw from different theories.
Yes? You're on the right track. Yeah? Hand over to your partner, yes? When in doubt, throw under the bus, yes? Yes?
One concept from another can be used to link them.
Uh-huh.
So he also gave an example of constructivism.
Uh-huh.
Whereby concepts of learning can be put together from different topics.
Okay, well done. Mr. Rule, we're very impressed that you actually listened to what he had to say. Eh? Any other ideas?
Yes.
Yes. Ah, got two hands, yes.
Conceptual framework is the roadmap of a research work.
A roadmap of a research work. That sounds like you were listening very carefully. Yes? Well done, yes.
It's not, I don't know what's the word in English, paradigm.
Paradigm?
Inside you put everything you need and that all linked together and you always go back to your theories.
Uh-huh.
And then explain from there where you're going.
Okay, great. So you guys totally get what conceptual framework is? Who's confused? Who's confused?
Only those who missed, who were not there.
You didn't come to that session?
Yes.
Are the notes, Professor Rule, are your notes available? Yeah? Okay. So you can go back to the notes and help. But anyway, so we're recapping here because I wanted to explain to you that there's this thing called a conceptual framework, right? And I know students often become very confused between the theoretical framework and the conceptual framework, right? But I see you've gone through that already. So the conceptual framework, you, as somebody at the back said, you draw from the different theories. Now, of course, by now you should know that you shouldn't be intimidated by this thing called theories either, isn't it? Because theories are just people's ideas, aren't they? And you're supposed to undermine them and question them and not accept them as the gospel. Okay? It's really, really important what I'm saying to you right now. Because students often go, oh no, but that's the theory and I can't touch it. That's not true. The whole point of research is to pull things apart, right? Is to start undermining and disrupting particular ideas. That's why you do research. If you're going to be doing research to simply confirm what somebody else has already found, then what's the point? It's going to be boring to all of us, right? So be exciting and start questioning things. So you're going to construct a conceptual framework from these particular words you are using, particular theories you are using. And so, for example, in Judith's case, to come back, because I'm fresh with your one right now, quite frankly, what is your conceptual framework?
You did see that I don't put up my hand.
What is your conceptual framework? What? But you've identified your concepts, right? So now that we've kind of tackled you a bit, what do you think it ought to be? Ask your peers. What do you think a framework ought to be? Yeah, she's definitely working in philosophy, but her conceptual framework? So the discipline she's in is definitely philosophy, but the conceptual framework? What is she going to use? What's going to be the parameters, the holding of this particular research? What's going to hold this research together? You're all whispering it, but you're just scared to say it. Yeah? Judith?
I'm taking notes.
She's mentioned, yes.
I remember there was a mention of social justice.
Social justice, yeah. But she was concerned about what? No, she never said values. You never said values. She said citizenship education. Yeah? So her conceptual framework better be located in citizenship education. Because if it's not, she's going to have a problem. Okay? She can't suddenly come and tell me now, well, actually, my conceptual framework is going to be one of African feminism. Okay, I don't get that because there's nothing in your research question that hints at that. Okay? Make sense? So you use your concepts, you use the literature, you use your theory to ask yourself, in which framework do I need to understand my particular research? How am I going to frame it? If I talk about instructional leadership, what about it am I interested in? So what are you interested in?
The roles of principals as instructional leaders.
The roles of principals as instructional leaders, right? Have you thought about your conceptual framework yet? What are the key concepts you're interested in? What has come up thus far in instructional leadership?
What I can say, Prof, I'm looking at the roles as what has come up now as the roles as in theories of instructional leadership for principals.
In theories? Is that going to be enough for your study? What else do you need to consider for your study?
I'm considering policies.
Policies? Okay. So it could be in your case that becomes the conceptual framework. Okay? Could be. I don't know enough about your study.
May I ask something?
Sure.
So it's within the main issue that you explore, but it's not something that I'm going to explain. So will I explain my conceptual framework, or is it embedded? Is it obvious?
It won't be obvious. You're going to have to explain it. Remember, the trick of your thesis or any piece of writing is that it has to be clear to whoever's reading it. So you might think, and this is the problem, we think it's already there. It's implicit because we are too attached to the writing. But when somebody else reads it, is it as clear? And so with the thesis writing, I encourage you to systematically clarify these things. So that when your examiners sit with it, it's made clear to them that you understand that this is what you needed to do. Don't assume anything and always operate at the lowest denominator. In other words, take into account the person who knows nothing about what you are saying. It's really important because students, I saw your hand, students often write in a way that they simply assume that they talk about, for example, they talk about the SA Schools Act. And people just assume that everybody else has read the SA Schools Act, right? But that is not true. Because most teachers will tell you, I've been in the teaching profession for 40 years, but I've never ever read a policy document. So I actually have no idea of the policy which informs my own profession. And this is the majority of our teachers. And then similarly, you're going to find this with your readers. So it's very important that you explain everything. Rather err on the side of offering too much explanation than erring on the side of too little. Because your examiners will come back, some of them will nitpick on that particular area and go, you were not clear about your framework, you were not clear about these things, and they will look at that particular thesis and from a completely technical point of view and say, this is what's missing. So err on that side rather. Understand?
For example, my contextual framework will be reading competencies in higher education in the South African context.
Reading competencies, right?
Reading skills. But where do you write about that? Do you write about that in chapter 3 in your methodology chapter?
You could decide to start chapter 2 with your theoretical framework by clarifying your concepts first. Remember, we're talking about clarifying the concepts, yes, right? You could do that there. It's entirely up to you and your supervisor. Your introduction, certainly, right? But in your case, for example, immediately you say reading competencies, then you say reading skills, right? And of course, those two things are two entirely different terms. And so I would then say to you, if you say competencies, what do you mean by competencies? And then I would say to you, as determined by whom? Or as determined by what? In terms of caps, are you using caps as a, then automatically, if you are using caps, I would say to you, well then, what has informed caps' understanding of competencies? This is the level you actually have to go at. Okay? So it's about clarifying. And once the joy of doing this, Judith, in particular for you, the joy of clarifying social justice, it does steer you into how you want to actually continue with your argument. Automatically, if you're talking about social justice, I will go, social justice for whom? For whom? Who are we talking about? And these are all things you have to clarify. So, and you can pick up on these parameter discussions in your first chapter, for example, where you say, in this study, I will be embarking, and I've understood it like this. And this is my context. It's important that you give due attention to clarifying those things, right? Okay, now part of what I was also asked to do is to look at, because I'm in education policy studies, Peter has asked me to also look at this thing called policy analysis. Now, again, students come to our department very often and they go, I'm interested in analyzing the language policy. Then I go, which language policy? And then they say, oh, the recent one. Well, which recent one? Right? So, and the thing about policy in South Africa is that there are so many different versions, right? And things get changed all the time. So you, again, have to be very, very clear. So for example, if I pick up on the leadership one, for example, students will sometimes make the mistake of thinking, when I talk about leadership, I only have to be concerned about the SA Schools Act and possibly PAN. Personnel, right? Administrative measures. But that's not true, because there are 2 other documents that talks about the standards of principalship, which came out later. So part of policy analysis is also making sure which policy are we actually talking about. Because I promise you it becomes you talk about a murky kind of swamp area in this policy, all right? Because you have to be very clear. Now, that for your purposes, picking up the earlier discussion, policy analysis can be used in both quantitative and qualitative studies, right? So you could, for example, go into policy, and you could say, for example, I'm going to look at the assessment policy as contained within CAPS. And remember, policies have act numbers and dates. That's important, right? Because again, there are different, our curricula changes have been immense. We've gone through waves of curricular reform, and we have a latest version of CAPS, for example, and there's a latest version, something called, now I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's a policy pertaining to the promotion and condemnation of learners, for example, right? Now, if you say, I'm looking at assessment, well, which one? I'm looking at both, great stuff. Then, you can, for example, say, I'm interested in a quantitative study to see how many grade 11s actually deliberately get held back. I'm going to do a survey study across the Cape Flats region, Mitchells Plain, whatever, of these particular schools, because I want to see how many schools have deliberately held back grade 11s in order to make sure that they have a higher pass rate in grade 12. That's a quantitative study, okay? And of course, then you can bring in other methods to analyze that. That's a whole different conversation. But a point I'm trying to make to you is that policy analysis is not limited to qualitative studies, right? You can look at matric pass rates, for example, dropout, what's called attrition rates, dropout rates of grade 9 learners, for example, and the factors which impact upon that, right? Or you could have a lovely study on the number of girl learners who leave school because of pregnancy. Or the other thing that's becoming a major issue, and I see this university is tackling it via its law department as well, in terms of how many girls don't go to school because they are menstruating and they can't afford to have proper hygiene care. So they stay home instead, right? And the impact that has. So these are, working with policy is wonderful because it does give you really wonderful insight into the workings. It also gives you insight into the absolute disaster of how often we have policy but we don't have the practice. And that's an important thing for you to understand, that just because something exists in policy by no means means that it exists in practice. Okay? Yes, Precious.
Prof, can I ask you, when we are looking at policy analysis, does that form part of the document analysis in my research, or it's something that I do on its own? Because, for example, in my study there is a central policy document that I'm looking at. Does that, the analysis of that document, does it come as part of my document analysis? Because there are other documents that I'm going to be looking at.
Yes.
Or it has to have its own.
You are making sense because I'm familiar with your study, right? So basically, in your case, you are also going to be interviewing ladies because there's particular questions you want to ask, but you're also interested in a particular policy. So that becomes another research method. You are using another method. Remember, there's something called triangulation in research. It's not simply, you've done that? Yeah? Great stuff. Should I test you on that as well? No? Okay. So basically, in addition to interviewing people, it's not enough for you to simply say, I want to understand disciplinary problems at the school, so now I'm going to ask the deputy principal about it. That's not going to be a substantive research, because the deputy principal is going to tell you all that he thinks you need to know and how wonderful he is in managing everybody. But if you chat to the learners, they will give you an entirely different version of things. And then you also need to triangulate by saying, well, what are your policies on discipline? Where would I find these things in writing? So you, in your case, you will be using your interviews with your ladies, but you're also interested in the policy, so that becomes a document analysis, where you look into the workings of the document. Okay? Make sense so far? Are there any other questions? Which part? Okay. So sometimes what students do, I won't use species as an example, but let's use an example of, I'm going to be going to that policy later, so let's look at teenage pregnancies, for example, right? So you are interested your study is interested to see how many young ladies have left school at 6 different schools over the last year due to pregnancy. So that's your interest. Why? Because you're a life orientation teacher and you've noticed that girls just don't come back, and it's a real issue for you. So that's your problem statement, right? So you're motivated by your own interest in the plight of the girl child. I'm just making these things up on your behalf. And so basically what's going to happen now is you need to go and find your schools. So you need to speak to the life orientation teacher and possibly the principal and say to them, when a girl child tells you I'm pregnant, how do you manage that? And the principal will say, well, we try to support her and we make sure she gets the work and we encourage her to come back, and he's going to give you the rosy version, right? Very few will say to you what they actually do to that pregnant learner, right? But if you speak to teachers, now what I'm triangulating, now I'm supporting, the teacher will say, yeah, the principal says it, but actually that's not what happens. The girls never come back because he makes it difficult for them to come back. When they do come to school, he says they're a poor role model to the girls, they're a poor example, they're an embarrassment, and they feel uncomfortable in coming back. So now those are the methods you need to use to get that data is going to be done via interviews, isn't it? You're going to have to engage. Whether it's going to be structured, unstructured, that's entirely up to you, but you're going to have to engage. But now you're also interested in what does the policy say, which is supposed to inform the management of teenage pregnancy in our schools. And the ED is a policy. In fact, there's a new one, right? So you need to then go and look at that policy. It's not enough for you to simply say, I've looked at the policy. You need to analyze what that policy says. Because what you're also going to be doing then is show the discrepancies or the gaps between what policy says and how it actually lives out in schools.
True.
Am I making sense to you?
Yes.
Yeah? You want power pressures? Great. Okay, so policy analysis. It's about finding the policy, firstly, making sure you're working with the right policies, right? And policies they're always connected to the Constitution, every single policy we have. So there's always an overriding umbrella understanding that of a social justice agenda, for example, of a particular value system, particular principles, which have to come through in every single policy and act which you find in schools. So therefore, you can never, ever have a policy at a school level, for example, that will talk about any form of exclusion, marginalization, discrimination, whatever. Automatically, it's going to be suspicious. Make sense? So you need to figure out which it is. Now, when you talk about policy analysis, it's about both the analysis of am I okay for time?
In about 2 minutes.
Are you serious? Sure. Okay. So it's about seriously. That's not fair. Right. So it's about policy process. It's important to explain to me. So if you talk about the SA Schools Act, for example, why do we have an SA Schools Act? Where does it come from? Remember, do not assume your reader knows what you are talking about. Yeah? Why do we have a policy on religion education? That's a lovely hotbed one. That's a stunning one. Because we have the hot men on the one side and the other people. We generally have all hot people on the one side, JC. Yeah, we do. I'm not making that up. It wasn't a blasphemy. There's a group called Wahot, right? Serious? No, I'm being serious. Hello? I'm actually being serious. A group of people who are opposed to religion in schools and they call themselves Wahot. Google it. You don't believe me. Right? Get Wikipedia. Confirm it for you. Okay. So, it's religion education policy. First thing I want to know is, what is the context of this policy? Okay? Now I have to go back. SA Schools Act. I have to go back some more, Constitution, which talks about that no religion will get preference over another. Right? Okay, and every single person has the same rights and same equality. You need to understand the process of that policy and why it has been amended in the way that it has. Because it's gone through various court iterations. In other words, various groups of people have taken that policy to court. And so now what's the impact of the legal framework on policy formulation? Profound, particularly when it comes to admission, school fees, and religion. Those are our hotbeds, right? So you need to be clear, the policy process. You also want to know, what does this policy say? Now, I don't have time to show it. I would have liked to have shown it to you, because if there's one policy that's really, really fun to read, it's the policy on how to manage pregnant learners. It's really great because it smacks of sexism, right? It's profoundly uninformed because it only ever talks about this pregnant girl as if she got pregnant by herself. Right? Some immaculate conception happened. She rocked up one day and there she was. Right? And even if we know that it's actually JC who's the bugger who's involved with the girl, we don't talk to him. He can come to school and she unfortunately has the brunt. So the policy talks about insane things, like the teacher having to manage the learner in prenatal care. In what world? In what world is this going to happen? It's not going to happen, right? And that learners must make informed choices. Informed by whom? The mere fact that they are pregnant tells you that there was a bit of misinformation to begin with, right? So we need to be clear about, so when you delve into policy, it's great fun. It's great fun, but you can only have fun if you read. Because else you're going to just go, oh yeah, this is right, this is nice, this is good. And you're going to agree. You must never agree with policy. Never agree with CAPS. CAPS is a... I'm being recorded. CAPS is not good. Never agree with policies. But you can only take these positions if you read the existing literature in relation to your field. Get different perspectives, different arguments. See what others have found. See what others have said. Now you read and you are informed. And you go, but this doesn't make any sense. Because in as much as we have a policy on religion education, I know in this day, my kids go to particular schools, and I sat through schools where I was asked to sing all kinds of hymns already. Right? And I sing along because, hey, that's where I come from. Right? Christian National Education did a good job with me. So, things haven't changed. So, the policy allows you to really pull apart certain things. But you can only do that if you are informed. So for those of you who don't wish to go down the murky road of empirical studies, we welcome you to philosophy. And we welcome you to conceptual analysis and policy. And we will open up a whole new world to you and show you policies that you didn't even know existed. Right? We can talk to you about values and citizenship and human rights, and you will end up lying on the floor laughing, but we will have fun. Okay? Okay, so that's my time with you. Thank you so much. I will make that available so that you can get it.
Right, thanks very much, Professor Davids. I think that was really interesting. And I think enlightening also for, I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks so much. So you've got a choice between the murky world of empirical studies or the conceptual swamp of policy studies. So enjoy your journey, and we're there to pull you out of if you sink, we're there to help try and save you. But I hope that you've got a bit of you've taken a few steps forward on approaches to research now, in thinking about your own approach, and maybe it's involved a few steps backwards as you've thought about some of your assumptions around your approach. But at least it'll help you to deepen your understanding, and as you write it up, to do it more thoroughly and in a more informed way, I hope. Yeah. Yes.
In empirical studies, sometimes you have a policy that you are against it. You have to analyze.
Yes.
How do you
Yes.
merge that?
I think that, the policy could come in different ways into the research. So some policy reading and analysis might happen in your literature review. Okay, so you might be doing an empirical study, but policy is part of the literature that you need to consult. So it might happen there. It also might be a method that you use within your study, as we were saying. So you might do some interviews, but you might also analyze the policy document as part of your methodology. So, or it might be the entire study might be an analysis of a policy. So there's different ways that it can play out, depending on your purpose and your research questions. So I think that it'll be specific to your research. Okay, so let's have one more question, then we'll have to tie it up. Yeah.
I don't know if it's a question or it's a comment.
Sure.
Quite a powerful presentation, Prof. But I'm still having a challenge about differentiating the conceptual framework and the theoretical framework. Maybe it was a question of time. The conceptual framework, I'm now clear about it. Very, very clear. But theoretical framework, I still cannot really define that thin line. Honestly, I have that challenge. Conceptual framework, today you open my mind, perfect. But theoretical framework.
So, what do we have? We don't have time really, but it's about using the existing theories that you have. So just quickly, what is your topic?
Actually, I'm investigating the reasons for the high attrition rate of students dropping physics at Cambridge or at A levels.
Okay, so it's the attrition of physics. So you would need to read in relation to that particular topic and see what the theories are. You know, theories are what? They're just ideas.
Yes.
So what are the particular current ideas regarding attrition, for example? What are the current ideas and perceptions regarding physical science? And there's lots of stuff on that. This fear factor that's attached to particular subjects, for example.
Okay.
And how students, the kinds of relationships students enter into with particular subjects. And our responses theoretically to them, for example. That's going to help you. I promise you, if you just spend your time reading, you will begin to see patterns of arguments emerging that will help you to say, particular theorists say this and that about physical science teaching, and this and that about physical science learning. And that's how you will give shape to your theoretical framework.
Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, thanks very much. Good. Right, so I just want to say thank you to our presenters for presenting and sharing their time with us. And also thank you to you for your participation. We've got, I think this is the most students we've had at one of these sessions. So it's really nice to see you coming and engaging, sharing your questions and your problems. And remember, no question is silly, because many other people have the same question. Right. So we'll send out the records of this meeting, and we also want to set up a site on the faculty website where you can access the previous sessions. So we will do that between now and when we meet again. And we'll also send out a notice for the next meeting, which is in July. And I think the focus there is going to be on data, on methods of collecting data. Right. So thanks very much. Yeah.